Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we step into the world behind Goodfellas, the world of Karen Hill, the woman who lived it, breathed it, and survived it. She wasn't a mob boss, an enforcer, or a snitch. She was something rarer. A wife caught between love and loyalty, glamour and danger, devotion and fear. Her story isn't just about crime. It's about what it costs to love someone who lives outside the law. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? We love seeing this little underworld grow across countries and time zones. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join our family of night listeners. Every week, we uncover the hidden stories behind the faces history forgot. The quiet ones, the dangerous ones, the ones who never got to tell their side. Now, take a slow breath. Let the noise of the day fade away, and prepare to step into the shadows, where truth, love, and betrayal all with the same face. This is Outlaw Icons. Your Sleepy Dawn. Chapter 1. Origins. Jewish girl from Long Island. The sound of a woman's breath trembles against the silence. Somewhere in the dark, a phone rings, once, twice, 3 times, before a hand picks it up. The voice on the other end is calm, official, and cold. "Mrs. Hill," it says, "we need you to leave the house. Now." For a moment, she doesn't answer. She stares at her reflection in the kitchen window, the ghost of a young girl from Long Island staring back at a woman who once believed she'd found love in the American dream. And just like that, the story of Karen Hill, the woman behind Goodfellas, begins. But before the gunshots, before the witness protection and the headlines, there was a little girl named Karen Friedman who grew up believing the world was simple, safe, and hers to shape. She was born on a cold January day in 1946 in New York City, a baby wrapped in soft blankets and quiet promise. Her parents were Jewish, middle class, proud, and disciplined. The kind of people who believed in family dinners, good schools, and the power of reputation. When Karen was still young, the Friedmans moved out of the crowded city and into the Five Towns area of Long Island, a cluster of comfortable suburbs where lawns were trimmed like carpets and gossip traveled faster than the mail. It was a world of order, tradition, and appearances. A world where the men went to work, the women ran the homes, and children were expected to shine. Karen wasn't born into wealth, but she was raised in security, the kind of safety that hums beneath the sound of sprinklers and car radios. Her father was quiet but firm, the sort of man who wore his decency like a pressed shirt. Her mother, warm and devoted, taught her that appearances mattered, but so did manners and kindness. To the neighbors, the Friedmans were the model of post-war Jewish respectability, hard-working, polite, and upwardly mobile. Yet beneath that calm surface, America was changing. The 1950s and 60s brought television dreams, restless teenagers, and the first cracks in the perfect suburban shell. Karen was a bright child, sharp-eyed and curious. Teachers described her as confident, maybe even stubborn, with a spark that sometimes startled adults. She was the kind of girl who noticed things, who could sense tension in a room before anyone spoke. In school, she kept her grades high and her hair neat, but she carried a certain edge, a quiet defiance that suggested she wanted something more than safety. She wanted excitement, maybe even danger, though she wouldn't have called it that then. She wanted to feel alive in a world that often felt rehearsed. At home, Friday nights were sacred, candles, challah, and family gathered around the dinner table. Her parents would talk about community events or the latest news from New York. They spoke with a sense of belonging, of being part of something that stretched back generations. But Karen's eyes often drifted to the window, to the lights outside, to the cars gliding past the snowbanks and street lamps. There was a restlessness in her, a longing she couldn't name. She loved her family, but she didn't want to become her mother, waiting for life to happen from behind lace curtains. By the time she reached her teens, the suburbs had grown louder. Rock and roll thumped through car radios, skirts grew shorter, and the idea of rebellion began to taste sweet. Boys from the city would drive out to Long Island on weekends, showing off cars, slick hair, and confidence. Karen watched them with a mix of curiosity and judgment, intrigued by their swagger, but wary of the trouble that followed. Her friends dreamed of doctors or lawyers. Karen dreamed of passion, of something unpredictable. In a world built on order, she was beginning to crave chaos. The five towns were polished but divided. Jewish families like the Friedmans built their homes beside Irish and Italian neighbors, each community keeping polite distance while pretending not to. Prejudice floated quietly under the surface, at the country club, at the PDA meetings, in whispered conversations over fences. Karen learned early that appearances could lie, that kindness could hide contempt, and that sometimes you had to wear a mask to belong. Maybe that's why she was drawn, later, to a man who lived his entire life behind masks. She graduated high school in the early 1960s, the era of Sinatra, Kennedy, and shifting dreams. While some of her classmates went to college, Karen chose something different. She studied to become a dental hygienist, practical, respectable, and independent. It was a small rebellion wrapped in responsibility. She wanted to work, to earn, to build a life that was hers alone. In the dental office, she learned discipline, the precision of small tasks, the intimacy of touching another person's world for a brief moment, the quiet confidence that came from competence. She had no idea how those same skills, control, patience, attention to detail, would one day help her survive in a world far darker than she could imagine. Outside the office, she dressed sharp. Neat hair, subtle lipstick, fitted skirts. She had a city girl energy that turned heads, but carried boundaries. She wasn't a pushover, and she didn't chase attention. It came to her naturally. Friends described her as warm, direct, and funny, but with a temper that flashed when provoked. She wasn't afraid to stand up for herself. Even then, there was steel in her softness, a trait that would one day save her life. The world around her was shifting fast. The Vietnam War, civil rights marches, and television brought chaos into living rooms. But in Long Island's bubble, life still looked calm. Country clubs, church picnics, neighborhood barbecues. Yet behind the calm, a different kind of American dream was quietly taking root. One made of cash, connections, and shortcuts. And in New York City's outer boroughs, that dream belonged to the mob. Across the East River, young Italian men were building empires from shadows, running numbers, hijacking trucks, owning nightclubs. To the suburban eye, they were danger personified. To girls like Karen, they were mystery, men who didn't play by the same rules her father taught her. They dressed better, talked smoother, and carried themselves with a confidence that ordinary men lacked. She didn't know it yet, but the world of quiet dinners and synagogue Sundays was about to collide with a world of late-night clubs, silk suits, and whispered deals. In those years, Long Island was a paradox, peaceful streets hiding the echo of nearby crime. The highways that carried businessmen to Manhattan also carried mob money back to the suburbs. Every diner had its regulars, every club its secrets. And somewhere between those two worlds, respectable and criminal, domestic and dangerous, was where Karen's path would soon lead. Fate doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it slips into your life like a song on the radio, familiar and irresistible. By 1965, Karen was 20, independent, and full of quiet confidence. She still lived at home, saving money, enjoying the safety net of family. On weekends, she went out with friends, dinners, parties, the usual rhythm of young adulthood. One evening, a friend suggested a double date. Karen hesitated. Blind dates weren't her thing. But she agreed, maybe out of boredom, maybe out of curiosity. The man's name, her friend said, was Henry Hill. She didn't know it then, but that decision, that single, casual yes, would rewrite her life forever. But before that night, before she met the man who would lead her into the underworld, Karen still believed in control. She believed she could shape her life, direct her choices, protect her future. She didn't know how fragile control could be when temptation wears a smile. She didn't yet understand that charm could be a weapon sharper than any knife. That was the beauty and the tragedy of innocence. It never knows the danger waiting behind curiosity. In the Five Towns, life went on as usual. Her parents were proud of their daughter's independence. Her mother sometimes worried that Karen was too outspoken, too willing to challenge men, too sure of herself. "You'll scare them off," she'd joke. But Karen wasn't afraid of scaring anyone. She wanted someone who could keep up, someone who could match her fire without trying to extinguish it. Maybe that's why she said yes to Henry. Maybe she was already looking for a storm. On quiet nights, Karen sometimes walked alone through the neighborhood. The scent of fresh-cut grass, the hum of streetlights, the soft chatter from open windows. She would think about her future, about the kind of life she wanted. Stability or excitement, safety or passion. The choices seemed simple then, like roads you could turn away from if they ever led somewhere dark. She couldn't have imagined how quickly those roads could close behind her. The truth about Karen's early years is that nothing about them screamed destiny. She wasn't poor or desperate. She wasn't looking for an escape from pain. She was looking for something to believe in, something bigger than the predictable rhythm of suburban life. And sometimes, when life feels too small, even danger can look like freedom. Her friends saw her as the responsible one, the girl who kept everyone in line, who made sure they got home safe. But even the responsible ones have dreams that flicker in the dark. Karen's were simple: love, adventure, a life that mattered. Maybe she thought she could have all three. Maybe she thought she could dance on the edge without falling in. By the time winter rolled into spring, the city's pulse was changing. Nightclubs buzzed with new music, laughter, and men who carried themselves like they owned the world. Karen's friend told her that Henry was different, quiet, confident, mysterious. He wasn't like the others. He didn't brag. He didn't need to. He had the kind of calm that came from power, the kind that drew people in without saying a word. The first time she heard his name, it meant nothing. Soon, it would mean everything. And so, the girl from Long Island, raised on Sabbath candles and good manners, would soon step into a world where loyalty meant survival, and love could become a prison. She couldn't have known it, standing there in her small bedroom, checking her hair in the mirror before that date. She couldn't have known that the reflection staring back would soon belong to someone else, a mob wife, a mother, a survivor, and eventually, a ghost in her own story. The phone call that would one day warn her to run was still decades away. The betrayals, the fear, the quiet nights in witness protection, all waiting, patient, invisible. For now, there was only the hum of the suburbs, the promise of youth, and the faint sound of fate approaching, slow, certain, and dressed in a suit. And when that doorbell finally rang, Karen Friedman's story, and the legend of Karen Hill, began. Chapter 2. A Chance Meeting. The night was cool, the kind of early summer evening that hums with possibility. Somewhere in Queens, headlights painted streaks of white across the asphalt. Radios murmured Sinatra through open car windows, and a young woman named Karen Friedman stepped out of her house without knowing that her life was about to split in two. She thought she was going on an ordinary double date, the kind that comes and goes without consequence. She didn't know she was about to meet a man who would pull her into the beating heart of America's underworld, a man who lived by silence, loyalty, and lies. His name was Henry Hill, and for Karen, he was both the beginning and the undoing of everything she knew about love, safety, and control. Henry wasn't like the boys Karen knew from Long Island. He didn't come from the same quiet neighborhoods, didn't spend his Sundays trimming hedges or playing golf. He was pure New York, smooth, restless, and charged with the kind of confidence that only came from knowing dangerous people. He wasn't tall or conventionally handsome, but he had presence. A certain electricity followed him, the way it does with men who've seen things they're not supposed to talk about. He was polite but distracted, like someone always halfway between charm and calculation. When he smiled, it wasn't wide or warm. It was a promise you couldn't quite trust. Karen's first impression wasn't love at first sight. In fact, she found him rude. He barely looked at her. He talked more to his friends than to her. On the ride home, she fumed in silence, her pride bruised. But something about his indifference stayed with her, like a song you can't stop humming even after you swear you don't like it. The next day, her friend told her Henry wanted another date. Karen hesitated. She wasn't sure if she wanted to see him again, but curiosity won. She told herself it would be just one more evening. It never is. The second date was different. This time, Henry was attentive, funny, even a little mysterious. He drove a nice car, wore a sharp suit, and carried himself like someone who didn't answer to anyone. He didn't brag, but everything about him suggested power, quiet, unspoken power. He knew the maitre d's at every restaurant, got tables that weren't supposed to be available, slipped cash to waiters who treated him like royalty. Karen wasn't naive, but she'd never seen anything like it. It wasn't just money. It was presence. People moved for him. Doors opened. Eyes followed. For a girl from the suburbs, it was intoxicating. She told herself it was confidence, not crime. On their third date, he took her to the Copacabana. It wasn't the kind of place she'd ever imagined herself walking into, the kind of club that glowed with danger and glamour. The moment they stepped inside, Karen felt the energy shift. Men in tailored suits nodded respectfully as Henry passed. The hostess smiled like she'd been waiting for him. And then, as if by magic, a table appeared right in front of the stage. No waiting, no names, no questions. Just the unspoken rule that Henry Hill got what he wanted. Karen didn't know what kind of man could make the city bend like that, but she wanted to find out. The drinks were cold, the music hot, and the air thick with cigarette smoke and confidence. Karen leaned back and watched Henry's world unfold. The handshakes, the whispers, the laughter that sounded like a language only insiders could speak. It wasn't polite society. It was something older, rawer, a world built on favors, fear, and respect. And Henry navigated it like he'd been born for it. To Karen, it was both thrilling and terrifying. Somewhere deep down, a small voice whispered that this was danger dressed as charm. But she ignored it, because when Henry looked at her, really looked, she felt seen in a way that suburbia never had. Their courtship moved fast. Henry would pick her up after work, take her to restaurants she'd never heard of, and talk about everything except what he did for a living. When she asked, he'd shrug and say he was in construction or union work. She didn't believe it, but she didn't press. Part of her didn't want to know. There was a certain power in not asking questions. As long as the gifts kept coming, the nights stayed golden, and the danger remained abstract, she could keep pretending it was all legitimate. That was the unspoken deal of falling in love with a man like Henry Hill. You could ask anything except the truth. For her parents, Henry was a walking alarm bell. They were proud, conservative, and deeply wary of outsiders, especially Italian Catholics from the city. The night they met him, the tension was thick enough to slice. Henry showed up late, wearing a suit that was too expensive for his supposed job. He was polite but detached, smiling only when necessary. Karen's father watched him like a hawk, every instinct screaming that something about this man didn't fit. After dinner, he told Karen he didn't trust him. Karen snapped back that he didn't know him. But deep down, she knew her father was right. She just didn't care. Because for the first time, she felt alive. Henry wasn't a man who courted through words. He showed affection through gestures, through action. One night, when Karen thought he'd stood her up, he arrived late with no apology. She exploded, furious, and demanded he take her home. On the way, she refused to speak. But when they reached her block, Henry suddenly stopped the car, got out, and crossed the street toward a man who'd been harassing her earlier. Without hesitation, Henry pulled a gun from his waist and pistol-whipped the man across the face. The sound of the impact cracked the night open. Karen froze in shock as Henry returned to the car, calm, unshaken, and handed her the gun. "Hide this," he said. And without thinking, she did. That moment, that single flash of violence, should have scared her away. But it didn't. It did the opposite. In that instant, Karen felt protected, claimed, chosen. For a girl raised in quiet safety, it was like touching fire and realizing she liked the burn. She didn't know it then, But that night marked the beginning of her transformation. Love and fear began to blur, and she would never again be able to tell them apart. Their relationship deepened quickly, like a storm that doesn't build, it arrives. Within months, they were inseparable. Karen's friends warned her. Her parents begged her to slow down, but she was in too deep. The excitement, the mystery, the rush of living just outside the law, it was addictive. And Henry knew it. He knew how to give her just enough truth to keep her close, and just enough lies to keep her hooked. He'd take her to smoky clubs, introduce her to men with heavy rings and hollow eyes, and whisper that they were friends from the neighborhood. She learned not to ask which neighborhood. One night, he told her he was going to North Carolina for business. He didn't say why, and she didn't push. When he returned, he was flush with cash, more confident than ever. He gave her jewelry, took her to dinner, made her laugh. He didn't talk about the truck hijacking he'd just helped pull off or the thousands of dollars stashed away in unmarked bills. To Karen, he was simply successful, a man who provided, protected, and adored her. The moral math was easy when you didn't know the numbers. By the spring of 1965, they decided to get married. The ceremony was a whirlwind. First, a quick civil ceremony in North Carolina, then a proper Jewish wedding to please her parents. Henry promised to convert, though whether he ever actually did remains uncertain. What mattered was appearances, and appearances were everything. Karen wore white. The band played. Her mother cried. On the surface, it was perfect, a union of love and promise. But beneath the smiles, something darker pulsed. Among the guests were men with names she didn't recognize, men who didn't shake hands as much as they measured people. They brought envelopes instead of flowers, whispered instead of laughed. And when they looked at Henry, it wasn't as a friend, it was as one of their own. After the wedding, Karen's life shifted gears. They moved into a nice neighborhood, bought furniture that gleamed, and filled their closets with new clothes. Henry always had cash. He always knew someone who could make things happen. Need a reservation? Done. Need a favor? Done. Need a problem to disappear? Done. It was a life of endless shortcuts, and Karen began to mistake them for success. When neighbors asked what Henry did, she'd smile and say he worked in construction. The lie rolled off her tongue so easily it began to sound like truth. But something inside her was changing. The girl from Long Island, who once dreamed of safety and stability, was learning to live by different rules. She began to notice the rituals, the unspoken codes that defined Henry's world. The way he always backed into parking spots, the way he never used last names, the way he noticed exits before menus. And when the phone rang late at night, she didn't ask who it was anymore. She just listened to his voice and pretended everything was fine. Still, the old Karen lingered somewhere inside, the girl who believed in good manners and happy endings. She tried to host dinners, attend synagogue, stay connected to her family. But the divide between her two lives kept widening. Her parents could sense it. Friends drifted away. And the further she followed Henry, the more invisible she became in her own story. Yet she couldn't stop, because the truth is, by then, she didn't want to. Love, when mixed with adrenaline, becomes its own drug. Every time Henry came home late, every time she smelled the faint trace of gun oil or saw the roll of cash he dropped on the dresser, it sent a shiver of fear and pride through her. Fear that he might not come home next time. Pride that he always did. She told herself she was different from other mob wives, that she was smarter, tougher, more in control. But control in that world was an illusion, and illusions were the currency she didn't know she was spending. The early years of their marriage were a blur of money, parties, and secrecy. Henry's world expanded. Bars, clubs, friends, and high places. He took care of everyone, handed out cash like candy, and made sure Karen never saw the cracks forming beneath the surface. She believed the fantasy because it was beautiful. She wanted to believe that love could exist in the shadows and still stay pure. But shadows always stretch toward the dark. Sometimes, late at night, Karen would wake to the sound of Henry pacing, phone pressed to his ear, whispering in tones too low to understand. She'd lie there, eyes open, heart racing, pretending to sleep. She knew better than to ask. In that silence, she learned something vital. That love in Henry's world wasn't about honesty. It was about endurance, about how much you could ignore and still stay standing. But fate doesn't care about endurance. It only waits. And it was waiting for Karen Hill, patiently, quietly, like a debt that always comes due. One evening, as she was cleaning up after dinner, the phone rang. A man's voice, unfamiliar, clipped, asked for Henry. When she said he wasn't home, the line went dead. Moments later, another call came, then another. Each time, silence. When Henry finally walked in, calm as ever, she confronted him. He smiled, kissed her forehead, and told her not to worry. She wanted to believe him, but something about the way he avoided her eyes made her stomach twist. That was the first time she felt the chill of what he really was. Not a husband, not a provider, but a man whose life belonged to people she'd never meet. The next morning, he was gone before she woke. The bed was cold, the house quiet. Karen sat at the kitchen table, staring at her reflection in the window, just like she would years later, when the government told her to run. In that reflection, she saw the faintest glimpse of who she was becoming. A woman standing on the edge of a secret world, still pretending she could step back whenever she wanted. But the truth is, once you step into that world, you never really leave. You just learn to live with the darkness. And somewhere out there, beyond the hum of Long Island traffic and the soft clatter of morning dishes, the mob was already watching, silent, patient, and ready to welcome Mrs. Henry Hill into its fold. Chapter 3: Marriage, Family, and the Glamour of the Underworld. The morning sun slipped through the blinds of their modest new home, cutting across polished floors and a kitchen that smelled of coffee, cigarette smoke, and perfume. Karen Hill, still learning to answer to that name, stood by the window and watched her husband pull out of the driveway, his car gliding down the street with a kind of effortless power. The neighbors waved. The world looked normal. But behind that suburban calm was a secret life that moved in whispers and shadows, a life where favors were currency and loyalty was law. She was 20 years old, married, in love, and already living inside a story she didn't fully understand. The girl from Long Island had crossed into another world, one where money came fast, respect was earned by fear, and silence was worth more than truth. At first, it felt like a dream. Henry always had cash, stacks of it, rolled tight with rubber bands, tucked into drawers, glove boxes, and coat pockets. There was always something new, a fur coat, a diamond bracelet, a dinner reservation at a place where the waiter knew her name before she said it. When she'd ask how he afforded it all, he'd smile that easy smile, the one that looked both reassuring and evasive. "I'm in construction," he'd say again and again. She stopped asking. It was easier that way. Easier to believe the lie than to live with the truth that lingered just behind it. Their house became a kind of stage, every detail curated for performance. Italian leather chairs, imported crystal, a record player spinning Sinatra and Tony Bennett. Friends came and went in a blur of laughter and loud voices, the kind of people who wore suits even on Sundays and carried themselves like they owned the air around them. Karen would cook, pour drinks, play the good hostess. But sometimes, in the middle of all that noise, she'd feel a pulse of unease. These weren't ordinary friends. There was something about their eyes, their laughter. It never quite reached their faces. Still, they adored Henry, and by extension, they adored her. In those early years, admiration was intoxicating. She had become Mrs. Henry Hill, and in the eyes of that strange new world, that meant something. She had grown up believing that success looked like stability, like quiet dignity, and earned comfort. But in Henry's world, success was louder. It was champagne pour before noon, jewelry boxes that never closed, and restaurants that stayed open just for them. It was walking into a club and having the light seem to follow your table. It was danger disguised as luxury, and for a while it felt good, too good. Karen had never been poor, but she'd never known wealth that shimmered like this. She'd never seen people move with such confidence, as if the rules that governed everyone else simply didn't apply. They were part of an invisible elite, untouchable, unstoppable, and in her mind, immortal. But even paradise has its price. The nights were late, and the phone never stopped ringing. Henry would disappear for hours, sometimes days, always with a vague explanation that left more questions than answers. Business, he'd say. Just business. When he came home, he'd drop wads of cash on the dresser, kiss her cheek, and act like nothing happened. And Karen, though she felt the unease building, told herself this was love. This was what loyalty looked like. To be with a man like Henry meant believing in him, even when he refused to tell her the truth. There were moments, though, when the curtain slipped. Once, she found a blood-stained shirt stuffed deep in the laundry hamper. When she asked, Henry didn't flinch. "Nosebleed," he said casually. But the way he said it, the flatness, the practiced tone, told her it wasn't the first time he'd lied like that. Another time, she noticed a pistol tucked beneath the couch cushion, wrapped in a towel. He caught her looking at it and smiled. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he said. "It's just for protection." Protection from what? He didn't say. But Karen didn't press. Somewhere inside, a quiet voice whispered that she didn't want to know. She was already too deep, already too in love, and walking away wasn't an option she could imagine. By 1967, they had their first child, a daughter named Gina. The birth softened Henry, at least on the surface. He was attentive, even tender, the way men like him rarely allowed themselves to be. Karen believed that maybe this child could anchor them, pull him away from the chaos she could sense creeping at the edges of their life. For a little while, it worked. Henry spent more time at home. They took family photos, had barbecues, and visited her parents more often. But the calm was temporary. The streets had a way of pulling him back, the way the tide always pulls the sand. No matter how far he drifted toward domestic life, the underworld waited with open arms. Karen's parents tried to stay supportive, but they saw what she refused to. They noticed the late-night calls, the expensive gifts, the way Henry always seemed to have money without explanation. Her father once confronted her, voice low but firm. "He's not who you think he is," he said, "and one day it's going to cost you." Karen didn't answer. She couldn't, because deep down, she knew he might be right. But love makes you complicit. You tell yourself that loyalty is bravery, that silence is protection. You confuse endurance with strength. And so, she smiled, brushed her father's warning aside, and doubled down on the fantasy. Henry's world was magnetic. Every weekend, there were parties, lavish dinners at smoky clubs, backroom laughter with men whose names she barely caught, women draped in diamonds and secrets. The wives talked softly among themselves, exchanging stories about shopping, kids, and husbands who worked nights. It was a club within a club, a silent sorority of women bound by luxury and denial. They never asked questions. They knew better. In that world, curiosity was a liability, and the truth was a kind of poison. Still, Karen couldn't help but notice the cracks. The glances the women gave each other when one of the men raised his voice, the nervous laughter when someone asked too much. It was glamour built on fear, beauty sitting on top of rot. When she looked at Henry, she saw both, the charm and the menace, the man and the myth. He could make her feel adored and invisible in the same breath. He had that ability men in power often have, to make love feel like ownership. But to Karen, it didn't feel oppressive. It felt intoxicating. He made her feel chosen. And in that small, glittering world, being chosen meant everything. It meant protection. It meant safety. Or so she believed. Their second child, Greg, was born a few years later. By then, Henry's reputation in the mob world had solidified. He was no longer just a kid from the neighborhood. He was reliable, smart, and connected. He had friends in every borough, men like Jimmy Burke and Tommy DeSimone, who were as charming as they were dangerous. Karen met them all, smiled at their jokes, served them drinks in her living room. She could feel the undercurrent beneath their laughter, the unspoken knowledge that these weren't ordinary men, but they were polite to her, even respectful. In their world, wives and mothers were sacred. Family was the illusion that kept them human. The money kept flowing. Karen never had to ask for anything. Shopping trips to Manhattan, dinners at the Copa, vacations paid for in cash. But the glamour came with shadows. She started noticing the other side. The wives whose husbands didn't come home, the whispers of arrests, the funerals that everyone attended but no one discussed. It was a world that fed on silence, and she was learning to starve herself of questions. And yet, despite the fear that sometimes crept in, Karen was proud of what they had built. She told herself that Henry was different, that he was smarter than the rest. He didn't drink too much, didn't gamble recklessly, didn't draw unnecessary attention. He had rules, and she clung to them like a safety net. But rules in that world are fragile things. All it takes is one bad night, one wrong word, one missed signal, and the whole structure collapses. Karen didn't know it yet, but the cracks were already forming. Sometimes, she'd watch Henry leave the house at midnight, dressed sharp, the scent of cologne trailing behind him like a promise. He'd kiss her cheek and say, "Don't wait up." And she'd stand by the window long after he was gone, staring at the red glow of his taillights until they disappeared into the dark. The silence afterward was heavy, filled with what she didn't want to admit, that her husband belonged to another world entirely, a world she couldn't enter but couldn't escape either. In the daylight, she played the part, the loyal wife, the loving mother, the picture of grace. But inside, she felt the tension growing. Every gift began to carry weight. Every dollar felt stained. There were moments, small ones, when she'd catch her reflection and barely recognize herself. The way she smiled too quickly, the way her eyes darted toward the phone every time it rang. She was learning to live in a state of constant anticipation, waiting for something she couldn't name. And then there were the women. Henry was careful, but not invisible. Whispers reached her, the kind of rumors that travel through smoky lounges and beauty parlors. She confronted him once, voice trembling but controlled. "Is there someone else?" He looked at her with that same calm smile and said, "You're crazy." And she wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him, because the truth would break the illusion, and the illusion was the only thing holding her world together. The years blurred. The money got bigger, the parties louder, and the nights longer. Karen found herself growing numb to it all. She no longer flinched when Henry came home with blood on his shirt or when strangers showed up at the door speaking in code. She'd learned the rhythms of his double life so well that she could sense danger before it arrived. And when it did, she'd switch into survival mode without hesitation. The girl from Long Island was gone. In her place stood a woman who could lie with a steady voice and smile while her world caught fire behind her. But even in the chaos, there were moments of tenderness. Nights when Henry would hold her close, whisper that she was his everything, that they were unstoppable. And she believed him, because belief was easier than fear. Love became the anchor she clung to, even as the water around her grew darker. She didn't realize she was sinking. One night, after a long dinner with friends, Henry drove her home in silence. The city lights blurred through the windshield. Karen reached for his hand, and for a moment, he squeezed back. But his mind was elsewhere, distant, calculating. She could feel it, the weight of secrets pressing down between them. When they pulled into the driveway, he turned off the engine, but didn't move. "You trust me, right?" he asked quietly. She nodded. He smiled that familiar half-smile and said, "Good. Then don't ever ask about my business." And just like that, another line was drawn, another piece of her innocence quietly erased. By the early 70s, Karen's world had transformed completely. The freedman's daughter was now a mob wife, respected, envied, and feared in equal measure. Her parents rarely visited. Old friends stopped calling. The distance between her old life and her new one had become a canyon she couldn't cross. But she didn't feel trapped. Not yet. She felt chosen, part of something larger than herself, something dangerous and eternal. What she didn't see was how quickly eternity can turn into exile. The night before Henry's next big score, he kissed his children goodnight, and told Karen not to wait up. She didn't ask why. She knew better. But as she stood at the window again, watching his car disappear into the dark, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Fear, pure and sharp. The kind of fear that doesn't come from what you know, but from what you've chosen not to know. And somewhere deep inside, she understood the truth that every mob wife eventually learns. The moment you start to feel safe in that world is the moment it's already slipping away. The danger isn't the gun or the money or the men in suits. The danger is believing you can live among wolves and never be bitten. For now, though, Karen turned off the lights, kissed her children's foreheads, and crawled into bed beside the empty space where her husband should have been. The night was quiet, almost peaceful, but in the distance, far beyond the reach of suburban calm, a storm was building, and it was coming straight for her. Chapter 4. Caught between love and crime. The night smelled of rain and exhaust, the kind of damp air that clings to skin and memory. Karen Hill sat awake in the half-dark, cigarette trembling between her fingers, watching the shadow of her husband move back and forth across their bedroom. Henry's voice was low, urgent, the phone cord twisted tight around his hand. She couldn't hear the words, only the tone, calm, dangerous, absolute. When he hung up, he turned to her with that familiar smile, the one that said everything's fine. But in that world, fine could mean anything. And in her gut, Karen knew the truth. She wasn't married to a man anymore. She was married to a storm. Love had brought her here, but love in a mafia wasn't like love anywhere else. It was sharp-edged, fragile, and transactional, a constant negotiation between affection and survival. Henry could be gentle in the morning, kissing her neck, making her laugh, and vanish by nightfall into a world she'd never see. He said he worked for the boys, and she never asked which ones. The less she knew, the safer they both were. That was the rule. But knowing and feeling are different things, and Karen was starting to feel the cracks. When she looked at him now, she didn't just see her husband. She saw danger in a silk tie. Still, there were moments that made her forget. Dinners at the Copacabana where the lights shimmered off her jewelry, the sound of laughter rising like smoke. Nights when they'd drive through the city with Sinatra on the radio, the skyline glittering like a promise. Henry would reach over, squeeze her hand, and whisper that they'd made it, that nobody could touch them. And for a few stolen minutes, she believed him. She wanted to, because the alternative, that their life was built on fear and crime, was a truth too heavy to live with. The wives all knew the game, even if they never admitted it. They dressed like royalty, smiled like actresses, and played their parts perfectly. But beneath the perfume and pearls was anxiety that never slept. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar car parked down the street, every sudden silence on the phone, it all carried meaning. They were experts at pretending not to notice. Karen learned from them. She learned to fold her worry into small, invisible shapes and tuck it away. She learned to look calm when her heart was running wild. She learned that love, in this life, was just another form of loyalty, and loyalty was survival. Henry's absences grew longer. Sometimes he'd disappear for days, returning with a grin and a handful of cash, his knuckles scabbed, his eyes a little too bright. She tried to ask where he'd been, but he'd kiss her, press money into her hand, and change the subject. The scent of whiskey and gun oil clung to him. He was always kind afterward, almost too kind. Karen told herself it was business, just business. But what kind of business left traces of blood on a shirt collar? One night, the illusion cracked. Karen was driving home from her mother's when a police car pulled her over. Two officers approached, one tapping the flashlight against her window. "Mrs. Hill," he said. The way he said it, the way he looked at her, made her stomach twist. They didn't arrest her. They didn't have to. They just wanted her to know they knew. She drove the rest of the way home in silence, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. When she told Henry, he brushed it off. "They're just trying to scare you," he said. "You didn't do anything wrong." And maybe she hadn't. Not directly. But she was part of the story now, whether she liked it or not. The line between guilt and innocence blurred faster than she could keep up. She didn't count cash, but she spent it. She didn't rob trucks, but she wore the diamonds they bought. She didn't pull the trigger, but she helped hide the gun once, wrapped it in a towel without thinking. Each small act, each quiet denial, wove her tighter into the web. The longer she stayed, the more she became like Henry, calm in the chaos, numb to the fear. That's how it happens. You don't wake up one day complicit. You just stop flinching. When Karen's parents came to visit, she put on a show. The house sparkled. The children were dressed perfectly. The table gleamed with silver. Her mother beamed with pride. Her father stayed silent, his eyes searching hers for something he couldn't quite name. When they left, her mother said, "You've built such a beautiful life." Karen smiled, but the words felt like a bruise. Because she hadn't built anything. She was standing on foundations she couldn't see, held up by men whose names she didn't dare speak. Henry loved her in his own way, fiercely and possessively. He could be sweet one minute, explosive the next. His temper was legendary, sharp, sudden, unpredictable. Karen learned to read the signs, the tightening jaw, the way he'd go quiet before the storm. But she also knew the man who brought home flowers for no reason, who played with the kids on the living room floor, who held her hand when they walked through the city. That duality was the trap, the tenderness that made the violence tolerable, the fear that made the love addictive. To outsiders, she looked lucky. Inside, she was balancing on a knife. There were other women. She knew it before she saw the proof, a lipstick stain on his collar, a phone number scribbled on a napkin. Confrontations were useless. He denied everything, his charm turning cold when challenged. "You're imagining things," he'd say, his tone dismissive, final. She'd cry, throw things, threaten to leave, but she never did. Because in that world, leaving wasn't just emotional, it was dangerous. Nobody walked away from men like Henry. Not without consequences. And besides, where would she go? The life she'd known before, the quiet suburbs, the small routines, felt like another planet. The mob world had swallowed her whole, and she didn't even know it. The other wives would whisper about affairs, but always in half sentences, always behind smiles. Everyone knew. Nobody cared. Fidelity wasn't expected. Loyalty was. As long as Henry came home to her, as long as the money flowed and the family looked perfect, she could pretend not to see the truth. That's what being a mob wife meant. Not ignorance, but selective blindness. Love wasn't about trust anymore. It was about endurance. But endurance has limits. One night, while Henry was out, Karen found herself pacing the kitchen, heart pounding with rage. The phone rang, and before she could answer, she heard a woman's voice on the machine. Soft, laughing, intimate. It was enough. When Henry came home hours later, she was waiting, shaking, gun in hand. She didn't plan to use it, but the look in her eyes told him she might. He didn't flinch. He took the gun gently, placed it on the counter, and said, "You're my wife. Don't ever forget that." The words sounded like love. They felt like a warning. In the daylight, she was still the perfect mother. PDA meetings, birthday cakes, family photos. She built normalcy like armor. But the cracks were showing. Nights were sleepless. The sound of sirens made her flinch. Every knock on the door felt like judgment. She started drinking more, not enough to lose control, just enough to dull the edges. Fear, when it becomes routine, turns into exhaustion. And exhaustion makes people dangerous, not to others, but to themselves. There were moments when she considered leaving. She even packed once, a small bag, just clothes for her and the kids. She sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for courage to arrive. It never did. When Henry came home, she unpacked before he noticed. The next morning, she burned the idea completely. Because leaving wasn't escape. It was exposure. As long as she was with him, she was protected. As soon as she left, she'd be alone. And in that world, alone meant vulnerable. The deeper Henry fell into the mob, the more the world around them began to rot. Friends disappeared, either to prison or the grave. New faces replaced old ones. Younger, hungrier, more reckless. The code that once governed everything started to fray. Drugs replaced discipline. Violence replaced strategy. Karen watched it happen from her kitchen window. The slow unraveling of the life she thought was permanent. Henry didn't see it, or refused to. He was chasing money now, faster and riskier than ever. The man who once told her he had rules now lived without any. Sometimes she wondered if this was karma, if all the time she looked away were coming back to collect. When she prayed, she didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked for time. Time to keep the kids safe. Time to hold the illusion together. Time before everything collapsed. But time in that life was a currency, and they were already in debt. One afternoon, as she was putting groceries away, the doorbell rang. Two men stood there, polite smiles, press suits. "We're friends of Henry's," one said. "He home?" Her stomach turned. She shook her head. They nodded, said they'd come back later, and walked away. But when she looked out the window a few minutes later, they were still there, sitting in a car across the street, waiting. She called Henry. He told her to stay calm, to keep the kids inside. "They're just checking on something," he said. But his voice, the quiet tension underneath, told her otherwise. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the window, lights off, staring at the street until dawn. The car didn't move. That was when she finally understood what her life had become, a cage with golden bars. Every luxury, every diamond, every whispered, "I love you," was just another layer of confinement. She couldn't run. She couldn't confess. She couldn't even speak the truth out loud. Her world had narrowed to two things: keeping Henry happy and keeping the family alive. Everything else was noise. But even cages break eventually. The police were circling, the FBI watching, the mob turning inward on itself. Henry was spiraling. More drugs, more paranoia, more danger. And Karen, loyal as ever, followed him into the chaos. Because that's what love demanded in their world. Not faith, not purity, but survival. To love a criminal meant learning how to be one, not in action, but in silence. The night would come, not far away, when Karen would find herself stuffing drugs into her purse, hiding them under bread and toys, walking past guards with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She'd tell herself she was doing it for her family, that it was temporary, that she could still find her way back. But deep down, she knew the line had already been crossed. The girl from Long Island was long gone. The woman in her place was something else entirely. Tougher, colder, unrecognizable even to herself. For now, though, she sat beside Henry on the couch, his arm draped lazily around her shoulders, the television flickering blue light across their faces. To anyone looking in, they were perfect, the picture of a successful couple, beautiful, rich, untouchable. But in the silence between commercials, Karen could hear it. The faint hum of fear, the ticking of a clock she couldn't stop. Somewhere in that sound was her future, shrinking, tightening, waiting to explode. And as the screen faded to black, she wondered if love could really survive when it was built on crime, or if it was just another lie they both agreed to believe. Chapter 5: Secrets and Betrayals. The night Henry didn't come home, Karen knew something had shifted. It wasn't the first time, but this absence felt different. Longer, heavier, quieter. The kind of silence that hums with questions you don't want answered. She lay awake, eyes open in the dark, listening for the sound of tires on gravel, for the familiar creak of the front door. Nothing. Only the soft buzz of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, the faint breathing of her children down the hall. She tried calling a few numbers she shouldn't have known. No one picked up. It was like her husband had vanished into the very air he breathed. Somewhere deep inside, fear and fury twisted together until they were indistinguishable. Because in her world, when a man disappeared, it meant one of two things. He was cheating, or he was dead. And both, in their own way, were betrayals. Karen had learned to live with Henry's secrets, but the lies had started to rot from the inside out. He'd tell her he was working, that it was just business, that he couldn't say more. But his excuses had begun to sound like confessions. The late nights, the lipstick stains, the sudden bursts of money, followed by days of tension. It all added up to something poisonous. She knew about the other women, though she never saw them. The perfume that wasn't hers, the whispers that reached her through the mob's quiet grapevine. In that world, nothing stayed secret for long. The wives might never say it aloud, but they all knew whose husbands were sleeping with whom. Loyalty was measured not by fidelity, but by silence. And Karen, though humiliated, played her part, because anger in that world could get you killed faster than love ever could. Still, there was a point when love turned to obsession. When Henry started seeing one of the cocktail girls from the clubs, Karen's rage began to take shape, cold, methodical, deliberate. She followed him once, driving through Queens with her hands trembling on the wheel. She saw his car parked outside an apartment complex, lights dim behind the blinds. She sat there for an hour, staring, her pulse thudding in her throat. When he finally came out, laughing, shirt half-buttoned, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just drove home in silence, each minute sharpening something inside her she didn't know she had. By the time he walked through the door later that night, she was calm, too calm. He kissed her cheek. She smiled, and as he turned away, she caught herself wondering what it would take to make him feel as helpless as she did. A few days later, she found out where the girl lived. She didn't tell anyone, didn't plan it. She just drove there in broad daylight, parked outside, and waited. When the woman came out, dressed to kill and laughing with a friend, Karen stepped out of her car and walked straight toward her. No words, no warning. She slapped her across the face so hard it echoed down the street. The woman screamed, stumbled back, cursed. Karen's hands shook as she pulled a pistol from her purse, the same one Henry had once made her hide. "Stay away from my husband," she hissed, her voice low but steady. The woman froze, eyes wide with a fear that tasted like victory. Karen didn't fire. She didn't have to. She turned, got back in her car, and drove away. Her hands were trembling so violently on the wheel, she could barely steer. But for the first time in a long time, she felt in control. A queen reclaiming her crown in a kingdom built on lies. When Henry found out, he laughed. "You're crazy," he said, half amused, half annoyed. But beneath his smirk was something else, respect. In that world, fury had its own kind of power. He didn't hit her. He didn't yell. He just looked at her differently after that night, as if realizing that the woman he thought was a prop in his story was capable of writing her own scenes. But the victory was short-lived. The affair didn't end. It just went deeper underground. And Karen, though she pretended not to care, felt the distance grow like a disease between them. She'd built her life around him, his moods, his crimes, his empire of shadows. And now, for the first time, she saw the possibility of him without her. It terrified her, because what was she without Henry Hill? A mother, a wife, a woman who traded safety for illusion. That illusion was breaking, and with it, her identity. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was structural. The mob world had rules for everything. Rules that men broke in private and enforced in public. Women were supposed to stay silent, to know their place, to keep the home spotless while the men spilled blood elsewhere. But Karen had stopped being silent. Her defiance didn't go unnoticed. Some of the wives started keeping their distance, afraid her temper might draw unwanted attention. Some of the men began to talk, small comments, quiet warnings. But the one who mattered most wasn't talking at all. Paul Vario, the man who'd once introduced her to Henry, had grown colder, distant, watching her from the corner of rooms with an unreadable expression. He was powerful, older, respected, and dangerous. And though Karen didn't see it clearly at first, his gaze carried weight, a kind of possessiveness that would soon lead her into a web even more tangled than before. There were rumors, ones that followed her quietly like shadows, that she and Paul had grown close, that she'd gone to him for help when Henry was in jail, and that something had happened between them, something unspoken, maybe unforgivable. The truth, like everything in that world, was messy and gray. Henry was behind bars at the time, his empire crumbling, his paranoia growing. Karen visited him, brought cash, smuggled messages, even helped move things he couldn't be seen touching. But she couldn't reach him anymore. The drugs had changed him. The distance had hardened him. And in the vacuum of that loneliness, she found herself orbiting the only man who still made her feel seen. Whether the affair really happened or not didn't matter. The rumor was enough to tear through the underworld like gasoline on fire. When Henry found out, the reaction wasn't rage. It was disbelief, then denial, then quiet destruction. He didn't scream. He didn't confront. He simply stopped trusting anyone, including her. Every look, every touch, every word became a test. The warmth between them evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculated alliance. They smiled in public, played the perfect couple for the world, but in private, the air was thick with tension. The children noticed. Karen tried to hide it, but kids know when love turns to ice. Her days became routine: school drop-offs, groceries, small talk with neighbors who envied her life. But behind the curtains, she was unraveling. And the more she tried to hold the pieces together, the more they cut her hands. The betrayal extended beyond the marriage. It lived in every lie she told to keep the illusion alive. She'd look at herself in the mirror and see someone she barely recognized. A woman who'd once believed in rules, now surviving without them. The fear was constant. The phone would ring, and her heart would jump. A car would slow outside, and she'd imagine bullets. That's what betrayal does. It doesn't end with a single act. It spreads, infects everything, until trust becomes a luxury you can't afford. Henry had his secrets, and now she had hers. And together, they danced on the edge of a truth neither could admit. Then came the day Henry didn't come home again, this time not for a night, but for weeks. He'd been arrested, caught in a drug bust that threatened to tear down everything he'd built. The papers called it routine, but Karen knew it was worse than that. When the feds came knocking, she froze. They didn't arrest her, not yet. But they asked questions, soft ones, polite ones, the kind that sound harmless until they're not. She played dumb, smiled, said she didn't know anything. When they left, she collapsed against the door, shaking. She thought she was safe as long as she didn't touch the business. But in that world, proximity was guilt. And guilt had no expiration date. Desperation turned to resolve. Karen visited Henry in jail, sitting across from him at a metal table, the smell of bleach and despair heavy in the air. He looked smaller, thinner, but his eyes still carried that dangerous calm. She leaned in, whispered, "What do you need?" He didn't say money. He didn't say freedom. He said, "Trust." And in that single word, she heard everything. His fear, his pride, his expectation that she'd hold the line while he rotted behind bars. She nodded. She'd always been the one who held things together. But something inside her shifted that day. She realized that Henry's world had never really protected her. It had used her. The loyalty she thought was love had turned her into a pawn. When she got home, the phone rang. A familiar voice, one of Henry's associates, offered to help. Cash, protection, connections. All she had to do was move a few things, deliver a few packages, no questions asked. She said yes before she even thought about it. And just like that, she crossed another invisible line. Maybe it was revenge. Maybe it was survival. Maybe it was both. The next morning, she drove with a trunk full of cash and contraband, her children strapped in the back seat, singing to the radio. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd become what she once feared, someone who could break the law and smile at the same time. The pressure built like a storm. The mob was watching her. The feds were circling. And Henry was losing his grip on reality. His calls from jail became erratic, paranoid, laced with suspicion. He accused her of things she hadn't done, demanded loyalty she no longer felt. "You're all I've got," he'd say, voice cracking under the weight of his own fear. And she'd answer softly, "I know." But in her mind, she was already preparing for the day she'd have to choose between him and survival. The betrayal wasn't one-sided anymore. Karen began to understand that the line between victim and accomplice doesn't exist in that life. It's just a matter of perspective. She lied to the police. She hid money in walls. She taught herself to smile when she wanted to scream. That was the real crime, not the drugs or the cash, but the way she learned to live without truth. It was easier that way. Pain demands honesty, and honesty could get her killed. When Henry finally got out, he wasn't the same. Prison had carved something out of him, left him hollow and twitchy. He was using more drugs than ever, talking faster, sleeping less. The paranoia followed him like a shadow. He'd sit at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, whispering names under his breath. Karen would watch from the doorway, wondering which version of him would turn around, the man she married or the ghost he'd become. The love was still there, somewhere under the wreckage, but it was buried deep, suffocating under years of secrets neither could speak. The world around them was changing too. The old order was breaking. Friends were being indicted, families moving, the news filled with names they recognized but couldn't say out loud. The Mafia that once looked untouchable was fracturing under the weight of its own betrayals. And in the middle of it all stood Karen, a woman who'd once believed she could balance love and crime without losing herself. Now she wasn't so sure. One night, as she tucked her children into bed, her daughter asked, "Mommy, why are the police always around our house?" Karen froze. She smiled, kissed her forehead, and said, "They're just making sure we're safe." But as she turned off the light, her chest tightened. Because she knew the truth, they weren't safe. They hadn't been for a long time. That night, Henry woke her with a whisper. "We might have to leave soon," he said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Pack light." Karen looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man on the edge. She wanted to ask where or why, or who was coming after them, but she didn't. She just nodded, because that's what their love had become, an endless series of nods in the dark. The lies, the affairs, the betrayals, they weren't chapters in her story anymore. They were the story, a slow, tragic transformation from innocence to complicity, from love to survival. And as dawn crept in through the curtains, Karen lay awake beside her husband, listening to the sound of his uneven breathing. Somewhere outside, the world was moving toward them. FBI agents, rival crews, destiny. She didn't know which would arrive first, but she knew this much. When it came, she'd be ready. Because in the world she'd built, survival wasn't about strength or luck. It was about silence. And Karen Hill had learned to be very, very quiet. Chapter 6. Violence all around. The world Karen Hill lived in was built on charm, but held together by fear. It was a world that smiled in the daylight and bled in the dark. The men who came to dinner wore pressed suits and polished shoes, but their hands were calloused from violence, their eyes always scanning for threats no one else could see. Karen didn't grow up around danger. She'd married into it, learned it the way a language is learned, piece by piece, word by unspoken word. By the time she realized what kind of life she was living, she was already fluent. Violence wasn't shocking anymore. It was routine. It was part of the air they breathed. She began to notice how quiet Henry got after certain phone calls, how he'd sit at the edge of the bed, head in his hands, muttering names she didn't recognize. Sometimes he'd come home smelling of gunpowder, the faint metallic tang of it clinging to his clothes no matter how many showers he took. He'd say there'd been a problem, or that someone got out of line. He never said more, but he didn't need to. The blood on his collar told the story for him. Karen pretended not to see. Pretending was survival. The mob wasn't an organization. It was a family that ate itself. Every favor came with a debt, every friendship with a hidden weapon. Karen watched as the people around her disappeared one by one, some to prison, others to graves no one talked about. At weddings, the laughter felt forced. At funerals, the silence was heavier than the earth on the coffin. She could feel the tension in the air wherever she went. It was like standing inside a storm that never ended, just shifted direction. And yet, there was glamour in the madness. Henry would take her out after a job, dressed in his best suit, as if to wash the blood from his soul with champagne. The restaurants glowed, the waiters smiled, the band played Sinatra. To everyone else, they looked like royalty. To Karen, they looked untouchable. That illusion was addictive. She told herself it wasn't her problem, that the violence was men's business, something that existed outside her world of children and dinner parties. But violence doesn't stay contained. It leaks. It stains everything it touches. The first time Karen truly saw it up close, she wasn't supposed to. Henry had told her not to come by the bar that night, but she'd grown tired of being shut out. She wanted to know what he did when he wasn't home. When she walked in, the air was thick with cigar smoke and sweat. Laughter bounced off the walls like gunfire. Men she knew from parties were huddled in corners, their voices sharp, their faces tense. Henry saw her and froze, his eyes flicking toward a back door she wasn't supposed to notice. He walked her out quickly, his hand firm on her arm, smile plastered in place. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. That night, she didn't sleep, because behind that door, she'd heard something. A muffled cry, a thud, a silence too complete to be harmless. Days later, Henry came home with a story. Tommy lost his temper, he said flatly, as if talking about the weather. It was an accident, but there was no such thing as an accident in their world. The victim, she later learned, was a man named Billy Batts, someone important, someone made. The news of his disappearance rippled through the underworld like a virus. Henry was tense for weeks after, pacing, snapping at the smallest things. She didn't know the details then, but she knew what it meant. Henry had crossed a line. Killing a made man was a death sentence. She didn't know how close that danger was to their front door, but she could feel it, creeping like smoke through the cracks of their home. For the first time, Karen felt afraid of the world she'd chosen. The glamour began to dim, replaced by paranoia. When she drove, she checked the rearview mirror every few minutes. When the phone rang, she waited for silence before answering. Even the sound of the doorbell made her flinch. She'd become an accomplice in her own captivity, trapped not by force, but by fear and comfort. Tommy DeSimone was the name that echoed in her nightmares. He was one of Henry's closest friends, and one of the most unpredictable men she'd ever met. There was something in his eyes, wild, playful but empty. He'd show up unannounced, loud, laughing, hugging everyone like a brother. But beneath the laughter was a volatility that made everyone nervous. One night, at a party, he leaned too close to Karen, his breath heavy with whiskey, his words slurred. "You're too good for him," he said, eyes glinting with something darker than flirtation. She laughed it off, but the look lingered. Later that night, when she told Henry, his face went cold. He didn't say a word. A week later, Tommy disappeared. The official story was that he'd been made, promoted in the hierarchy. But Karen knew better. In that world, people didn't get promoted, they got buried. Years later, she'd find out she was right. It was around that time that Karen started keeping secrets of her own. Small things at first. Money tucked away in hidden places. Letters burned before Henry could read them. She'd learned to play both sides, to be ready for any outcome. If Henry went to prison again, she'd have something to survive on. If he ended up dead, she'd have a way out. But there was no real escape. The mob had roots everywhere. Lawyers, cops, politicians, even priests. It was a system that swallowed everything, and she was part of it whether she liked it or not. The violence began to seep into the rhythm of their marriage. It was no longer shocking when Henry came home angry, shouting, breaking things. The drugs made it worse. Cocaine, pills, alcohol. It all blurred together into a single haze of paranoia. He'd accuse her of betrayal, then collapse in tears. The next morning, he'd act as if nothing had happened. Karen learned to read the patterns, to adjust her tone, her timing, her silence. It was like living with a wild animal. One wrong move, and everything could explode. Yet, even in those moments, she felt sympathy for him. That was the trap. The same man who terrified her was also the only man who understood her world. When word spread that the FBI was closing in, the tension snapped into panic. Henry started hiding money in the walls, flushing drugs down the toilet, burning records. Karen helped. She didn't ask what any of it was for. The children, still too young to understand, watched their parents move through the house like ghosts. It was chaos disguised as routine. She'd wake in the middle of the night to find Henry sitting in the dark, smoking, staring at nothing. If anything happens, he'd say softly, "Take the kids and go to my brother's." She'd nod, though she knew she'd never make it that far. Violence had become invisible, embedded in every choice, every silence. The mob didn't just kill people, it consumed them. It turned men into monsters, women into ghosts, and families into collateral. Karen had once thought the blood was something that happened out there, in alleys, bars, warehouses. But now she understood it was everywhere. It was in their home, in their bed, in the air they breathed. You didn't have to pull the trigger to be part of it. You just had to stay. The worst part wasn't the blood or the fear. It was the normalization. How easily life adapted to horror. How quickly she stopped reacting. When a friend's husband was found dead in his car, she brought a casserole to the widow's house and made small talk like it was any other day. When another was arrested, she wrote a letter of support for the family. It was what mob wives did, maintained the illusion, kept the machine running. The men might have been criminals, but the women were the scaffolding that held the lies upright. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Karen poured herself a drink and turned on the television. The news was showing another story about organized crime, another set of mugshots, another reporter saying the words the FBI believes. She stared at the screen until her vision blurred. She didn't see strangers. She saw her life, Henry's friends, her neighbors, men who'd eaten at her table. It struck her then, with the force of a revelation, that there was no finish line in this world. There was only survival, one day at a time, until survival ran out. That same night, Henry came home later than usual. His eyes were wild, his shirt untucked, his hands shaking. He said nothing at first, just poured himself a drink and sat down across from her. The silence was unbearable. Then, in a flat voice, he told her something she'd never forget. "It's done," he said. "Bats. Tommy. It's all coming back." She didn't know what he meant, not exactly, but she could hear the weight in his tone, the dread of consequences catching up. "They'll come for us," he said quietly, "if they find out what really happened." Karen didn't respond. She just stared at him, realizing that the man sitting across from her wasn't the charming boy from Queens she'd fallen in love with. He was a survivor of his own destruction, and he was dragging her down with him. In the weeks that followed, the paranoia reached its peak. Strange cars parked outside. Phones clicked mid-conversation. Strangers lingered too long in diners. Henry stopped trusting everyone. He carried weapons everywhere, even in the house. He made Karen practice what to say if the feds came knocking. It wasn't a life anymore. It was a siege. And through it all, she stayed, because leaving was more dangerous than staying. The mob had long memories, and betrayal was repaid in blood. Karen once asked Henry if he ever regretted it. The violence, the crimes, the lies. He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Regret gets you killed," he said. "You just keep moving." It was the closest thing to honesty he'd ever given her. And in that moment, she realized they were the same. She didn't regret it either. Not the life, not the danger, not even the fear. Regret was a luxury. She'd traded it for survival long ago. By now, the violence wasn't just something they lived near. It was the force that defined them. It was the reason they had money, the reason they were hunted, the reason they still existed at all. Every dollar, every diamond, every night of laughter had been bought with blood. And deep down, Karen knew it couldn't last. Nothing that sharp ever does. On the night before everything changed, she stood by the window again, watching headlights blur past like ghosts. Henry was in the next room, whispering into the phone, his voice low and frantic. She caught fragments, names, numbers, fear disguised as control. When he hung up, he looked at her and said, "It's starting." She didn't ask what. She didn't need to. The violence that had always surrounded them was no longer outside. It was coming home. As she turned off the lights and climbed into bed, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had burned itself out, leaving only emptiness behind. And in that emptiness, she understood the truth she'd spent years avoiding. Violence wasn't something that happened around them. It was who they had become. And by the time the first knock came at the door, it was already too late to pretend otherwise. Chapter 7: Arrest, Prison, and the Smuggling Roll. The day the police came, the air outside was still, unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that sits heavy on the chest just before a storm breaks. Karen Hill woke up to the sound of pounding on the door, sharp and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of fate. For a moment, she thought it was another one of Henry's friends, some late-night visitor from the shadows, someone needing money, or a favor, or a place to hide. But when she looked out the window, she saw the flash of badges. The morning light caught the metal just right, and everything inside her dropped. It wasn't the mob this time. It was the law, the dream, the lie, the empire. They had all come to collect at once. Henry was still half asleep when they burst in, guns drawn, voices loud. Karen stood frozen as men in dark jackets poured into their home, rifling through drawers, flipping over mattresses, shouting commands that blurred together in chaos. Her children cried. One of the agents grabbed Henry, slammed him against the wall, read him his rights with mechanical precision. She could barely breathe. This wasn't one of those mob raids they'd laughed about before, when everyone knew someone would pay someone and things would go away. This felt different. It felt final. When they dragged him out, Henry looked back at her once, just once. There was no apology in his eyes, no fear, only exhaustion, the kind that comes when a man realizes the game is finally ended. Karen ran after them, shouting his name, but one of the agents held her back. "Ma'am, stay inside," he said, voice firm but not unkind. "You don't want to see this." She didn't listen. She watched as they shoved him into the car, hands cuffed behind his back, head low. And in that instant, she understood what it meant to lose everything, not slowly, but in one violent, irreversible moment. The house was quiet after they left. Papers and clothes were scattered everywhere, the floor littered with pieces of their life, letters, toys, money they hadn't even counted yet. Karen picked up one of Henry's shirts from the floor, held it to her face, and wept until her throat ached. She had always known this day could come, but knowing something in theory is different from standing in its ruins. The reality was colder, sharper, crueler. When she finally sat down, the phone started ringing. Friends, relatives, associates, everyone wanted to know what had happened. Some pretended to be concerned, others just wanted gossip. A few whispered that Henry had been sloppy, that he'd gotten too greedy. No one offered help. That was the rule of their world. When one falls, the rest scatter. Loyalty has an expiration date when the feds are involved. Henry was charged with drug trafficking, conspiracy, racketeering, words that sounded distant and abstract, but carried the weight of decades in prison. The newspapers called it a major bust. They printed his mugshot beneath a headline that used words like notorious and mob associate. To the outside world, it was sensational. To Karen, it was humiliation. The neighbors stared. Reporters called the house. The children's school whispered. The Hill family, once admired for their glamour, had become a spectacle. When she went to see Henry in jail for the first time, she didn't know what to expect. The drive there felt endless, every mile taking her further from the life she knew. The prison loomed like a concrete beast, gray and unfeeling. The metal detectors, the guards, the echoing footsteps, all of it felt like another planet. And then there he was, sitting behind glass, his face thinner, his eyes wild with something between fear and denial. He tried to smile, to sound normal. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said, his voice low. "I'll fix it. I always fix it." Karen stared at him through the glass, her hand pressed to the cold surface between them. "Fix it," she whispered. "How, Henry? You can't fix this with a few phone calls." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She could see it in his eyes, the panic he was trying to hide, the calculation already beginning. He wasn't thinking about guilt or innocence. He was thinking about survival. On the drive home, the world looked different. The streets she'd driven for years now felt foreign, dangerous. Every shadow looked like an enemy. Every passing car a threat. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Henry's friends, men who once filled their home with laughter, had gone silent. Some had fled. Others had turned on him. The empire was collapsing, and she was trapped inside the rubble. The weeks that followed were a blur of visits, phone calls, and sleepless nights. Henry's lawyers said there was a chance, if he stayed quiet, if the right people got paid, if luck didn't run out. But luck doesn't last forever in the mob. One by one, the dominoes fell. Arrests, interrogations, betrayals. Men Henry had trusted since childhood were cutting deals, trading secrets for leniency. And with each new headline, Karen felt the walls closing in tighter. The money was disappearing fast. Legal fees, bribes, debts, every dollar burned like paper. The luxury that had once surrounded her now felt like a curse. The cars, the jewelry, the furs, they all looked like evidence. She sold what she could, hid what she couldn't, lied to whoever asked. The kids still needed to eat, still needed to go to school, still needed to believe their father was coming home. So she smiled, told stories, pretended. Pretending was the only thing she had left. When she went back to see Henry, he was different. Paranoid, angry. He talked in circles, about people watching him, about guards who were paid off, about deals that could still be made if she just helped him. She didn't understand at first. Then he said it plainly. He needed her to smuggle something in. Drugs. Small quantities, hidden carefully, delivered through kisses, clothing, food. It's just to keep things moving, he said. To keep people happy. If they're happy, I'm safe. Karen froze. The thought made her sick. She'd spent years turning away from the truth, pretending she wasn't part of his crimes. And now he was asking her to become part of them. I can't, she whispered. I won't. But Henry had that look again, the one that made saying no impossible. You don't understand, he said. If you don't help me, they'll kill me in here. That was the line that broke her. Because she believed him. The first time she did it, her hand shook so badly she could barely drive. She hid the small package the way Henry told her, wrapped and taped, tucked into places she didn't want to think about. The guards barely looked at her. She smiled, made small talk, played the innocent wife. When she handed it off during the visit, Henry's fingers brushed hers, his eyes glinting with gratitude and guilt. You're saving my life, he whispered. She nodded, but inside, something hollowed out. Whatever innocence she still had was gone. It didn't end there. Once you cross a line like that, there's no going back. Each visit brought new instructions, new risks. She was careful, meticulous, terrified. Every time she left the prison, she expected flashing lights behind her, sirens, handcuffs. But nothing came. That was the cruel irony. Crime rewarded with silence. The system didn't see her yet, and that invisibility was its own kind of punishment. Henry's paranoia grew worse. He talked about people turning on him, about messages hidden in letters, about guards who could be bought or killed. Karen listened, trying to calm him, but inside, she was breaking. The man she loved was disintegrating before her eyes, eaten alive by fear and cocaine. She wanted to save him, but she didn't know how. Every act of love now felt like an act of destruction. Outside the prison, her life was unraveling. The money was gone. The house was under surveillance. Strangers called at night and hung up without speaking. The kids asked when their father was coming home, and she didn't have an answer. Sometimes she caught herself staring at them and wondering if they'd ever forgive her for the life she'd given them. She couldn't tell them the truth, but she couldn't lie convincingly anymore either. They were old enough to sense the dread in her voice, the way she jumped at sudden sounds. Childhood shouldn't feel like a crime scene, but in that house, it did. Weeks turned into months. The headlines faded, but the fear didn't. The mob was shifting, new faces rising, old ones falling. Karen heard rumors that Henry's old crew was being watched, that indictments were coming. She started to believe that even if he got out, there wouldn't be a world left for him to return to. The golden years of the Mafia were dying, and they were dying with it. One afternoon, she went to visit him, and he didn't show. They made her wait for hours before finally telling her he was in isolation. For his own safety, the guard said, his tone too casual. She drove home in silence, heart pounding. She didn't sleep that night, or the next. When he finally called days later, his voice was hoarse, trembling. "They're going to kill me," he said. "If I don't find a way out, they'll kill me." She could hear it then, the truth behind the fear. Henry wasn't trying to survive anymore. He was preparing to run. The next time she saw him, he told her about a deal. A way out. Witness protection. Testifying against his own. The words sounded impossible, almost blasphemous. In their world, betrayal was the ultimate sin. Informants didn't live long. But Henry was serious. "It's the only way," he said. "For me. For you. For the kids." Karen felt sick. The thought of running, of changing names, of abandoning everything. It was unthinkable. Yet the alternative was death. That night, she sat in her car outside the prison, engine off, headlights fading into darkness. The weight of it all pressed down on her. The years of silence, the lies, the fear, the blood. Somewhere deep inside, she'd always known this was where it would end. Not with glory, not with wealth, but with surrender. And the cruelest part was that surrender felt like freedom. When the call finally came weeks later, telling her to pack up, to leave everything behind, to start over under a new name, she didn't cry. She didn't even hesitate. The girl from Long Island was long gone. What was left of her had been carved into someone else entirely. A woman who could lie to the law, to her children, to herself, and still call it love. The night before they left, she stood by the window one last time. The same window she'd watched the police through months before. The city outside was quiet, indifferent. She thought about all the people they'd lost, all the friends who'd vanished, all the blood that had been spilled for the illusion of control. It had all led here, to this silence, this emptiness. When Henry finally walked through the door, free but not free, she looked at him and saw everything they had been. Young lovers, reckless dreamers, partners in crime. She wanted to hate him, but she couldn't. They were bound by too much love, fear, guilt. Two people trapped in a story that had long since stopped being theirs to write. The next morning, they left before sunrise, a family of ghosts driving into anonymity. As the car disappeared down the road, Karen didn't look back. The prison gates, the flashing lights, the broken promises, they all stayed behind her, swallowed by distance. Ahead of her was nothing certain, nothing safe, but at least it was quiet. And in that quiet, she felt something strange. Not peace, not relief, but a fragile, dangerous kind of hope. Because even after everything, the crimes, the betrayals, the fear, Karen Hill still believed, somewhere deep inside, that maybe, just maybe, survival could still count as redemption. Chapter 8. Witness Protection. New Identities, New Dangers. The night they vanished from the world, it wasn't with gunfire or headlines. There were no dramatic escapes, no speeding cars through back alleys. Just quiet. A silence so deep it pressed against the walls of the motel room where Karen Hill stood, watching her husband pack the last of their lives into 2 suitcases. The curtains were drawn, the lights dimmed, and the sound of their children breathing in the next room was the only thing that made the scene feel real. The mob wasn't chasing them yet, but the fear of being found was already suffocating. This was the end of one life and the start of another, except it didn't feel like starting over. It felt like erasing yourself completely. Karen didn't cry when they left. She didn't have any tears left for goodbyes. Every farewell had already been said in whispers over the years, to friends who disappeared, to homes they'd abandoned, to versions of themselves that died quietly between the chaos. Henry tried to reassure her. "It'll be better," he said. "We'll be safe." But his words sounded thin, fragile, like glass about to crack. Safety was a foreign word in their marriage. It had never meant peace. It had meant survival. And survival, she knew, was just another form of captivity. The drive out of New York was long and silent. The marshals didn't talk much. 2 of them sat in the front seat, eyes on the road, their guns within reach. Karen held her children close in the back, watching the city fade into a blur of headlights and rain. For years, she had looked at that skyline as a symbol of everything they'd built: money, power, reputation. Now it was a threat. Every light, every street corner could be the last glimpse before the past caught up. When the city finally disappeared behind them, she realized there was no going back. The freedman's daughter, the mob wife, the glamorous woman from Long Island, she was gone. The name Karen Hill didn't exist anymore. The first place they were sent to was somewhere in the Midwest, a quiet town, too quiet. The kind of place where the loudest sound at night was the wind against the trees. They were given new names, new stories, new birthdays. The government taught them how to lie convincingly, as if lying wasn't already second nature. Karen was told she was now the wife of a salesman, mother of two, originally from Florida. Henry was supposedly a construction foreman. They were told never to mention New York, never to speak the names of the people they once knew, never to use the word Mafia. It wasn't just about safety, it was about transformation. The past had to be buried so deeply that even their own children couldn't dig it up. At first, the silence felt like freedom. No more phone calls in the middle of the night. No more strange cars idling outside. No more pretending not to see the blood on Henry's shirts. The air was cleaner, lighter, but the quiet carried its own kind of weight. Karen didn't trust it. Peace, in her experience, always meant something was about to explode. Henry struggled the most. He wasn't built for anonymity. He thrived on attention, on power, on being recognized. In New York, his name meant something. In this new world, he was nobody, just another face in a supermarket line. He'd walk into diners expecting free coffee, only to be met with blank stares. Karen could see it eating at him, the humiliation of becoming invisible. He tried to make friends, but his stories were too big, too suspicious. When he laughed, it was too loud. When he spent money, it was too fast. The man who once knew every backroom in the city now looked lost in small-town diners that closed by 10. Karen adapted better. She had always been a shapeshifter, someone who learned early how to wear masks. But this mask felt heavier. She wasn't playing a role anymore. She was living inside one. Every introduction, every conversation, was a performance. "Oh yes, my husband's in construction," she'd say with a practiced smile. "We moved here for a fresh start." People believed her. They saw what she wanted them to see: a polite, modest housewife. No one would guess she'd once sat beside mobsters at the Copacabana, wearing diamonds worth more than the houses on her street. She didn't correct their assumptions. Pretending to be ordinary was the only way to stay alive. But pretending doesn't erase what came before. It just hides it under the surface, waiting to resurface when you least expect it. Sometimes, in the middle of folding laundry or cooking dinner, Karen would hear something, a knock too firm, a car backfiring, and her body would react before her mind did. The panic would rise like smoke, her hands shaking, her breath caught in her throat. She'd look at her children, smiling and carefree, and feel both envy and guilt. They didn't remember the worst of it. They didn't know what their father had done, or what she had done to protect him. They only knew that they'd moved a lot, that their parents were always watching the clock, that strangers sometimes stared a little too long. The marshals checked in occasionally, always polite, always distant. They'd bring envelopes, instructions, reassurances. "You're safe here," they'd say. Karen would nod, thank them, smile. But safety felt like another lie. The news still carried whispers of the old world: arrests, indictments, deaths. Sometimes she'd see familiar names flash across the television and quickly change the channel before her kids could ask questions. Henry pretended not to care, but Karen could see it in his eyes: the longing, the loss. The mob had been his purpose. Without it, he was just a man with too much history and nowhere to put it. Money was a problem. The government provided enough to live on, but not enough to live well. Henry wasn't used to limits. He missed the envelopes of cash, the free meals, the unspoken privileges. Soon, he started taking small risks: side deals, hustles, shortcuts. Karen begged him to stop. "You're going to get us killed," she whispered one night, her voice trembling. He kissed her forehead, told her not to worry, said he knew what he was doing. But he didn't. The thing about men like Henry was that they couldn't live quietly. The adrenaline was their addiction. Normal life bored them to death. The first time Henry got caught breaking the rules of witness protection, it wasn't serious, just a warning. He'd used his real name on a shipment form, a small slip. But small slips in their world could be fatal. The marshals moved them again, farther this time, to another town, another house, another set of fake smiles. Each move felt like a reset, but the fear followed them like a ghost. Karen packed the same bags over and over, memorized new phone numbers, practiced new lies. She was tired of reinvention, tired of disappearing. Every time they changed names, she lost another piece of herself. She thought about her old life often, not the violence or the fear, but the certainty. Back then, she knew who she was, what role she played, where she belonged. Now she belonged nowhere. Even her reflection felt like a stranger's. The glamorous woman from years ago had been replaced by someone cautious, subdued, quiet. She'd gone from being the wife of a man everyone knew to being the wife of a man no one could ever know again. That was the cruel irony of witness protection. It promised safety by erasing identity. Sometimes, late at night, when the kids were asleep, she'd pour a glass of wine and sit in the dark, replaying memories she couldn't share. The laughter in crowded restaurants, the soft glow of Manhattan at midnight, the smell of Henry's cologne after a night out, before the lies caught up. She missed it, not because it was good, but because it was real. This new life felt like acting without a script. The quiet suburb, the PDA meetings, the forced normalcy, it all felt hollow. And beneath that hollowness, the old Karen still breathed, restless and haunted. Henry's restlessness grew dangerous. He began calling old contacts, trying to make small deals, trying to feel alive again. Karen begged him to stop. She knew the risk. One wrong call, one careless word, and they'd all be dead. But he couldn't stop. It was in his blood, woven into the fabric of who he was. "I can't just sit here," he'd snap. "I'm not built for this." She'd look at him then, really look, and see not the man she'd married, but the criminal who could never truly leave his crimes behind. One night, he came home late, high, agitated. He slammed the door, pacing like an animal in a cage. Karen watched from the kitchen, heart pounding. "What happened?" she asked softly. He turned, eyes wild. "They're on to me," he whispered. "I think they know where we are." The words hit her like ice. "Who?" she asked. He didn't answer. He just started packing a bag, throwing things together without reason. That night, they slept in shifts, lights on, waiting for a sound that never came. The next morning, the marshals were at the door. Someone had made a call they shouldn't have. They were moving again. Each move chipped away at their sanity. The kids began asking questions Karen couldn't answer. "Why do we keep leaving? Why can't we tell our friends where we're from?" She told them it was because of Henry's job, because of safety, because of grown-up things. They didn't believe her. Children always know when the adults are lying. The looks they gave her, confused, distant, sometimes scared, were worse than any accusation. She was raising them inside a lie, and every day she told it, it became harder to remember the truth. By the late 1980s, Henry had been moved so many times that even he stopped keeping track. The government's patience was wearing thin. His old habits, his arrogance, his inability to stay hidden, they made him a liability. Karen knew it was only a matter of time before they were on their own. She started saving again, quietly, the way she used to. Cash hidden in books, jewelry sold for bills, favors called in from people she wasn't supposed to know anymore. She'd learned that safety wasn't about geography. It was about preparation. There were nights when Henry would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, muttering names of men long dead. Karen would hold him until he stopped shaking, whispering that it was over, even though she knew it wasn't. The past doesn't disappear just because you change your name. It follows you, whispering through dreams, lurking in mirrors, waiting in the corners of small-town diners. Every face in the crowd looked familiar. Every laugh sounded like a threat. Years passed like that. Restless, unsteady, shadowed. The witness protection program had promised them a clean slate, but all it gave them was exile. They weren't dead, but they weren't alive either. Henry was still Henry, reckless, impulsive, defiant. And Karen was still the woman cleaning up after him, holding the family together with lies and fear. The difference was that now, no one knew their story. They had become ghosts in a world that had forgotten them. Karen often thought about what it meant to disappear. In the beginning, she believed it was escape. Later, she realized it was punishment. To disappear is to lose not only your enemies, but your identity. To live every day as someone else is a slow kind of death. She wasn't Karen Friedman anymore, or Karen Hill. She was a name the government had chosen for her, a paper version of herself. And yet, even in that emptiness, she refused to break. She had learned too much about survival to let anonymity destroy her. One evening, years after the first escape, she stood in her backyard under the stars, the children grown, the house quiet. She thought about everything they had lost, the home, the friends, the certainty of who they were. And yet, somehow, she was still standing. The mob had tried to control her life. The government had rewritten it, and Henry had nearly destroyed it. But she was still here, still breathing, still unbroken. That was her victory, quiet and unseen. Not revenge, not redemption, just endurance. The kind that doesn't make headlines, but leaves its mark in the silence after the storm. Because in the end, witness protection wasn't about hiding from danger. It was about living with it. Every day, every breath, every memory, without letting it consume you. Karen Hill, or whatever name she now carried, had become what the world could never imagine. A survivor who'd outlasted the mob, the government, and even the ghosts of her own past. And as she stared into the night, she realized that for the first time in her life, no one knew where she was. Not the mob, not the marshals, not even Henry. And in that solitude, in that small, trembling quiet, she finally understood what freedom really felt like. It didn't come with safety. It came with being forgotten. Chapter 9, Cracks and Breakdowns, Addiction, Paranoia, and Betrayal. By the time the new house settled into silence, the kind of silence that hums louder than noise, Henry Hill was already unraveling. He'd gotten everything he asked for: freedom, protection, a second chance at life. And yet it wasn't enough. The man who had once thrived on chaos couldn't survive in peace. The quiet that was supposed to keep him safe started to eat him alive. And for Karen, that silence became a ticking bomb, slow, invisible, and certain. At first, the signs were small. He'd stay up too late, pacing the kitchen with a drink in hand, his mind still running on the rhythms of the old life. He'd talk to himself, mumbling names, deals, ghosts. When she tried to sleep, she could hear him whispering in the next room, voice low, frantic. "They're watching," he'd say under his breath. "They know where we are." She told herself it was paranoia, just nerves, just Henry being Henry. But as the weeks stretched into months, the tension grew sharper. He wasn't just restless, he was spiraling. Drugs had always been part of Henry's world, but now they became his oxygen. He said it helped him stay awake, stay sharp, stay in control. But Karen knew the truth. It was the only thing that made him feel alive anymore. Cocaine didn't just give him energy, it gave him purpose. It filled the void left behind by the mob, by the danger, by the noise. And it turned him into someone she barely recognized. His once charming confidence was replaced by jittery arrogance. His jokes came out as threats. His laughter was manic, hollow. Karen tried to fight it at first. She'd flush the drugs, hide the money, plead with him to stop. "You're going to get caught," she'd whisper in the dark, voice trembling. "You're going to kill yourself." He'd laugh it off, kiss her forehead, promise to quit. But the promises always dissolved by morning. She'd wake up to the sound of him chopping lines on the kitchen counter, his reflection staring back at her through the window, pale and frantic. The man she'd once loved was fading into a ghost that never slept. The drugs brought back the old habits, The hustling, the scheming, the endless need for control. Henry started getting calls again, secret ones, the kind that made him step outside to talk. He was making deals, small at first, but growing bolder. The witness protection rules meant nothing to him now. He couldn't live by anyone's terms but his own. The marshals warned him to stop, threatened to cut him loose, but he didn't care. He was addicted to the danger, to the adrenaline that came with knowing he was one step from destruction. Karen saw it all unraveling, but she was too tired to stop it. Years of fear had drained her. She was living on muscle memory now, taking care of the kids, paying the bills, pretending everything was fine while her husband burned himself alive in slow motion. The arguments became routine. She'd yell, he'd deny, and then they'd both collapse into silence, too exhausted to care. She wanted to leave, but she didn't know how. Where could she go? Who could she be without him? Even in his madness, Henry was still the center of her gravity. The paranoia infected everything. Henry started checking the locks 3, 4, 5 times before bed. He'd sit by the window with the lights off, watching the street for cars that weren't supposed to be there. He'd accuse her of things she hadn't done, talking to people, giving away secrets, setting him up. The first time he said it, she laughed. The second time, she cried. The third time, she packed a bag and almost left. But when she opened the door, she froze. Outside, the night looked vast and empty. There was no one waiting for her, no world to go back to. She was trapped between a past that would kill her and a future that didn't exist. The kids saw more than she wanted them to. They'd walk into rooms where Henry was red-eyed and shaking, muttering to himself, or passed out at the table, his head buried in his arms. Karen tried to protect them, to build some kind of normalcy around the chaos. She'd make dinner, help with homework, smile through it all. But they weren't children anymore. They understood. Fear ages you fast in that kind of house. Every slammed door, every whispered argument, every police siren in the distance was a reminder that safety was just a story their parents told to help them sleep. Money became a problem again. Henry couldn't hold a real job. Too proud, too unstable, too addicted. The government stipends were gone, the savings dwindling. Karen sold what little she had left, made excuses, borrowed from people she shouldn't have. Every dollar felt like borrowed time. Henry's drug habits were expensive, his paranoia even more so. He bought locks, cameras, alarms, anything to keep the invisible threats at bay. But no alarm could protect him from the enemy inside his own head. One night, Karen woke to find him gone. The car keys were missing, the house dark. She waited for hours, pacing, heart racing, every sound outside setting her nerves on fire. When he finally came home, his clothes were drenched in sweat, his hands trembling. "They followed me," he said, voice cracking. "They're watching everything." He was shaking so hard she thought he might collapse. She led him to bed, held him like a child, and whispered that everything would be okay. She didn't believe it. She just needed him to. The line between fear and delusion blurred until it didn't matter anymore. Henry's paranoia became hers. She started seeing things too. Cars that lingered too long, faces she thought she recognized in supermarkets. Once, she swore she saw one of the old crew members at a gas station, watching her from across the pumps. When she blinked, he was gone. Maybe he'd never been there. Maybe she was losing her mind too. The betrayal came slowly, like everything else in their life. Henry began disappearing for days at a time. When he came back, he was evasive, twitchy, talking about business. She didn't need to ask what kind. The smell of cocaine gave him away before the lies did. One night, she found a bag of it hidden behind the bathroom vent. Another night, she found receipts, cheap motels, restaurants, phone calls to names she didn't know. The affairs had come back, casual, desperate, thoughtless. It was like watching history repeat itself on fast forward. But this time, the betrayal didn't even hurt. It just confirmed what she already knew. She'd lost him long ago. Karen started drinking more. Not enough to lose control, just enough to make the nights bearable. The bottle became her buffer against the noise in her head, against the memories that crept in when the house got too quiet. She'd sit at the kitchen table long after everyone was asleep, staring at nothing, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the echo of a life that didn't exist anymore. The silence that used to terrify her now felt like company. When the marshals came again, they weren't offering help this time. They were tired of Henry's violations, tired of cleaning up his messes. They told her they were cutting them loose, that he was no longer under protection. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Without the government's shield, they were exposed, floating between the law and the mob, unwanted by both. Henry didn't care. He thought he could handle it. "I'll be fine," he said. "I always land on my feet." Karen didn't answer. She'd seen what landing looked like in his world. It always ended in a fall. After that, things moved fast. Henry started running small cons again, petty hustles, low-level deals with people who didn't know who he used to be. He was chasing ghosts, trying to rebuild an empire that didn't exist anymore. Karen watched him destroy what little they had left with the same mix of rage and pity she'd felt for years. She didn't even try to stop him this time. He was beyond saving. They both were. The children grew distant. They'd stopped asking questions, stopped expecting stability. One night, her son told her quietly, "We're just waiting for him to die." The words hit her like a punch, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Henry had become a ticking clock, and everyone in that house was waiting for it to stop. Karen thought about leaving again. She even packed her things, just like before. But this time, she didn't stop at the door. She drove. Not far, just far enough to breathe. She found a motel on the edge of town, checked in under a fake name, and sat on the bed staring at the ceiling. The room smelled like cigarettes and old carpet. She felt empty, weightless. For a moment, she thought about never going back, about disappearing completely, for real this time. No names, no lies, no past. But when she closed her eyes, she saw her children's faces. She couldn't leave them behind. She'd spent too long keeping them safe to abandon them now. So she drove home before dawn, back to the wreckage, back to the noise. Henry barely noticed she'd been gone. He was too busy trying to outrun his own paranoia. The last time she saw him truly sober was one quiet morning. He was sitting at the table, staring at the wall. His hands were steady for once. "You ever think we could have done it different?" he asked. Karen didn't know how to answer, because even if they could have, they wouldn't have. It was never in their nature. They were built for chaos, drawn to it, bound by it. She just nodded. "Maybe," she said softly. The breakdown wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a fight or an arrest or a gunshot. It was slow decay, days blending into nights, nights into years. By the time Henry finally left for good, the man she'd fallen in love with was long gone. What remained was a shell, still moving, still talking, but hollow inside. When he walked out the door that final time, Karen didn't chase him. She didn't even cry. She just stood there, watching the space he'd left behind fill with morning light. The quiet that followed wasn't peace. It was aftermath, the soundless wreckage of a life built on secrets and destroyed by them. Karen Hill had survived the mob, the law, and the violence. But the thing that almost killed her wasn't any of those. It was love. Love for a man who could never stop being who he was. Love for a life that had no place left to go. And as she sat alone that night, the clock ticking softly on the wall, she realized that survival wasn't the same as being alive. Survival was just breathing through the ruins, waiting for the noise to fade. And when it finally did, all that remained was her own heartbeat, steady, defiant, and still here. Chapter 10. Life After the Fall. Morning light spilled through thin motel curtains, weak and uncertain, as if even the sun wasn't sure this place deserved warmth. Karen Hill sat at the small wooden table, a half-empty cup of coffee in front of her, and stared at the clock that hadn't ticked right since she checked in. The silence was thick, the kind that used to make her anxious, but now felt like the only kind of peace she could stand. Henry was gone again, drifting through whatever was left of his world, and for the first time, she didn't care where he'd gone. The woman who once panicked at every disappearance now felt nothing but relief. There was no screaming, no threats, no late-night paranoia, just quiet. And for someone who had lived decades inside noise and fear, quiet was almost sacred. But peace was never simple for Karen. Even after Henry left for good, the past followed like an echo that refused to die. It lived in her sleep, in the smell of cheap cologne or the sound of a car engine idling too long outside. Sometimes, she would catch herself glancing over her shoulder in grocery stores, or slowing her pace when footsteps trailed behind her. The mob had long since moved on, the names that once haunted her buried or locked away. But fear isn't something you can bury. It stays lodged under the skin, a permanent residue of survival. Life after the fall wasn't about rebuilding. It was about learning to live with the ruins. The government had long stopped checking in. Her protection long expired. Whatever new names or fake histories they'd given her were useless now. She was on her own, just another woman in another small town, renting rooms, working odd jobs, and pretending she hadn't once lived a life of luxury and terror. The people she met thought she was quiet, maybe a little lonely. No one suspected she had once been the wife of a man whose name was whispered in courtrooms and headlines. The money was gone, spent years ago in the slow bleed of survival. She worked in a diner for a while, then a dry cleaner, later as a clerk in a pharmacy. The pay was small, but it was honest, and that honesty was strange and unfamiliar. No envelopes of cash, no bribes, no secrets to protect. Just work, fatigue, and the steady comfort of anonymity. For a woman who had lived decades pretending not to know the truth, there was a strange freedom in having nothing to hide. Still, there were moments when the past reached out and grabbed her by the throat. A movie scene that mirrored her own life. A headline about organized crime. The smell of gasoline or the flash of a red car in the corner of her eye. The memories came uninvited, vivid and sharp. The night she smuggled drugs into prison. The morning she watched agents drag Henry out of their home. The echo of gunshots she never saw, but always heard in her dreams. She'd shake it off, pour another coffee, tell herself she was done being haunted. But ghosts don't need permission to linger. Her children were grown now, scattered across the country under new names of their own. They didn't talk much about the past, and Karen didn't push. They deserved distance, even if it meant losing her. She blamed herself for the life they'd been forced into, the lies they'd had to learn before they could read. When they called, the conversations were short, small talk, weather, work, nothing real. Once, her son said quietly, "Mom, we made it out. That's what matters." She wanted to believe him, but survival and healing aren't the same thing. Survival is what you do when there's no choice. Healing is what you do when you finally have one. And she wasn't sure she ever would. There were people who tried to find her over the years. Journalists, authors, strangers obsessed with the mythology of Goodfellas. They wanted the real story, the woman behind the movie. She never answered. They all saw Karen Hill as a character, a piece of pop culture, but the woman behind the name wasn't a story to be told. She was a scar that refused to fade. The world loved to romanticize the Mafia, the glamour, the power, the danger. But for her, it had been nothing but erosion. Every secret, every luxury, every diamond had been bought with fear. The violence wasn't cinematic. It was ordinary, casual, domestic. It lived in the quiet moments, in the small humiliations, in the way love became another form of control. Sometimes she wondered if Henry still thought about her. If he remembered the woman who'd once stood beside him at the Copa, the girl who'd believed that loving him was worth the danger. She doubted it. Men like Henry didn't remember. They moved forward, always chasing the next scheme, the next rush. He'd become a caricature of his old self in the years after witness protection, giving interviews, writing books, pretending to be reformed while still feeding off the fame of the life that had destroyed them. Karen saw one of his interviews once, late at night on television. He was older, heavier, still talking fast, still deflecting blame with charm. "I had no choice," he said, smirking at the camera. "That's just how it was back then." She turned off the TV halfway through. That smirk, the same one that used to make her heart race, now made her sick. He wasn't sorry. He never would be. For years, Karen had carried the guilt for both of them. She defended him to her family, lied for him to the police, risked her life for him. But somewhere along the line, she stopped being his accomplice and became his casualty. It wasn't a clean break. There was no single moment of realization, no epiphany in the dark. It was gradual, like waking from a long nightmare and realizing you're not the same person anymore. The love had burned itself out, leaving behind only ashes and exhaustion. By the time she finally let go, there was nothing left to save. But letting go didn't mean forgetting. She couldn't erase the life she'd lived any more than she could erase the scars it left behind. When she thought about it now, it was like watching someone else's story, familiar but distant. The young girl from Long Island, the woman in fur coats and diamond rings, the terrified wife hiding cash in walls. They all felt like versions of her that had died at different points along the way. What remained was someone quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous in her own way. Not because she was violent, but because she understood survival too well. The years blurred. Small towns came and went. Apartments, jobs, names, each one blending into the next. Time didn't move in a straight line anymore. It looped, folded, replayed itself. Every new place felt temporary, every smile rehearsed. But every now and then, in moments of stillness, she'd feel something close to peace. She'd sit on a porch, watch the sun set behind the hills, and realize that no one in the world knew who she was. No one cared. And for the first time, that anonymity didn't feel like punishment. It felt like grace. There was one night, years later, when the past caught up to her again, but not the way she expected. She was closing up the small cafe where she worked when a man walked in just before the doors locked. He was older, tired-looking, with a face that seemed familiar in a way she couldn't place. He ordered coffee, black, and sat in silence. When he looked up, their eyes met for a moment too long. She froze. His voice was low, hoarse. "You're her, aren't you?" She didn't answer. He smiled faintly, not cruelly. "Don't worry. I'm not here for that. I just wanted to see the woman who made it out." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he nodded once, finished his coffee, and left without another word. When the door closed behind him, she locked it, leaned against the counter, and let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. She never saw him again. But that night, she understood something she hadn't before. That survival wasn't just luck or fear. It was endurance. It was outlasting the people and the stories that were supposed to destroy you. In the quiet years that followed, Karen stopped running. Not because she stopped being afraid, but because she was tired of living like a ghost. She started using her real name again. Not the one on the papers, but the one that felt like hers. She didn't tell anyone her story, but she stopped pretending she didn't have one. The past became something she could carry instead of something that carried her. She grew old quietly. The world around her changed. New wars, new scandals, new generations who thought Goodfellas was just a movie. Sometimes she'd catch pieces of it on television and watch for a few minutes, just long enough to see her life turned into entertainment. The music, the laughter, the glamour, it all looked so clean, so easy. She'd smile bitterly and turn it off. No film could ever capture what it really felt like. The sound of a knock that might be death, the metallic scent of fear, the slow erosion of trust. In her later years, she lived alone in a small apartment by the ocean. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. The mornings were quiet, the afternoons slow. She'd walk the beach sometimes, her shoes sinking into the sand, and think about all the lives she'd lived. The young girl who dreamed of adventure. The wife who fell in love with a gangster. The mother who lied to keep her children safe. The survivor who vanished into the shadows. All of them were pieces of her, and none of them defined her completely. She was all of it and none of it. She was what was left after the world stopped caring. Every now and then, she'd get letters from people who claimed to have known Henry, or who said they admired her for what she'd survived. She never responded. What did she say? There was no redemption story to tell, no neat ending. Survival isn't heroic. It's messy, lonely, and full of compromise. The world wants tidy narratives, but real life never gives them. On her last night in that apartment, the wind outside howled against the windows, rattling them like ghosts knocking to be let in. She sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, a small lamp casting a warm glow across the room. The ocean was dark, the horizon fading into black. She thought about Henry, about the children, about all the noise that had filled her life. And for the first time, she didn't feel haunted. She just felt done. The world had moved on from her story, but she hadn't. It lived in her still, in every scar, in every silence. Yet somewhere between the fear and the fading memories, she'd found something she never thought she would: peace in the ordinariness of it all. No gunfire, no police sirens, no running. Just the sound of waves against the shore and the rhythm of her own breathing. If anyone had asked her, in that final stretch of quiet years, what it all meant, what it was like to live through hell and come out the other side, she would have said this: that survival is not about winning. It's about enduring. It's about walking through the wreckage of who you used to be and realizing you're still here. That's all it ever was. That's all it ever needed to be. And as the tide rolled in, carrying the last echoes of the past with it, Karen Hill, the woman behind the myth, the wife behind the legend, closed her eyes and finally let the noise of the world drift away. Chapter 11. The Woman Behind the Myth. The myth of Karen Hill began the moment her life stopped being private. Once the reporters came, once the movie cameras turned her marriage into a spectacle, she ceased to exist as a person. She became a symbol, a side character in someone else's story, the wife, the accomplice, the woman who stayed. But the truth was never that simple. The truth lived in the quiet moments between the headlines, in the nights when she sat awake listening to her husband breathe and wondered if love could really survive the life they'd chosen. Karen had never asked to be famous. The fame came like a curse, born out of betrayal and survival. When the book came out, when the film followed, she watched her life unfold on a screen, rewritten for drama, stripped of nuance. She saw her name, her voice, her choices turned into entertainment. People called her strong, others called her complicit. Some romanticized her, others condemned her. But none of them saw the woman behind the story, the girl who'd grown up in Long Island believing in love, the mother who'd hidden fear behind a smile, the survivor who learned to stay quiet because silence was safer than the truth. She remembered the first time someone recognized her. It was years after she'd disappeared, in a supermarket in a small coastal town where she thought no one knew her. A woman with bright eyes and a too familiar grin had approached her by the fruit section. "You're her, aren't you? The one from that movie." Karen froze. The woman said it like a compliment, like she was meeting a celebrity instead of someone who'd spent decades trying to forget. Karen smiled, shook her head, and said, "You've got the wrong person." But her hands were trembling as she reached for the apples. When she got home that night, she unplugged the phone and sat in the dark, staring at nothing. She realized then that anonymity was a fragile thing. One mistaken glance could shatter it. The movie had painted her as glamorous, tragic, volatile. It wasn't wrong, but it wasn't right either. Hollywood had a way of cleaning up the dirt, of turning terror into drama, of softening the edges that cut deepest. They didn't show the endless paranoia, the way every sound could feel like a threat. They didn't show how loneliness eats away at a person, how fear becomes its own kind of addiction. They didn't show how she'd once stood in her kitchen, holding a gun with shaking hands, wondering whether she was the villain or the victim. They only showed what fit the story: a woman who loved too much, stayed too long, and learned too late. The irony was that she hadn't even been angry when the film came out. She was numb. The world finally knew her story, but it wasn't her story anymore. It belonged to strangers now, writers, directors, audiences who'd never lived through what she had. People would talk about her like they knew her. She must have loved them a lot, they'd say, or she should have left. But love and fear, in her world, were twins. They lived in the same body, spoke with the same voice. Leaving wasn't freedom. It was suicide. The myth grew over time. Henry's interviews didn't help. He'd talk about her with that smirk, half affection, half dismissal, calling her crazy, dramatic loyal. Always loyal. He'd forget to mention that loyalty in their world meant survival. That she'd kept his secrets while he broke her trust. That she'd carry the weight of both of their sins because he didn't have the strength to feel guilt. She used to think if she could explain it all, if she could tell her side, people might understand. But she'd learned the hard way that people didn't want the truth. They wanted the story. In the years that followed, she tried to find pieces of herself that hadn't been consumed by him. It wasn't easy. She'd spent so long being Henry's wife that she'd forgotten who Karen Hill had been before him. The woman who loved to laugh too loud, who dreamed of traveling, who believed in family dinners and happy endings. That woman had been buried under decades of lies and survival instincts. But sometimes, late at night, she could still feel her, like a faint pulse under scar tissue. When she thought about her younger self now, it was with a strange mix of pity and admiration. That girl hadn't known what she was walking into. She hadn't known what it meant to love a man whose world was built on violence and deceit. But she'd learned fast, faster than she should have had to. The mob wives had taught her the unspoken rules. Don't ask questions, don't show weakness, don't let the neighbors see you cry. Those rules had kept her alive, but they'd also kept her trapped. You can survive anything if you stop feeling it long enough. For years, she believed she could separate love from the crime, that she could build a life around the chaos without becoming part of it. But there's no halfway in that world. The moment she took that first envelope of cash, the moment she smiled through her husband's lies, she'd crossed the line. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Survival doesn't ask for permission. It demands sacrifice. There are people who told her later that she should have left earlier, that she should have saved herself. They didn't understand that leaving wasn't simple. You can't just walk away from a man like Henry Hill. Not when he's part of the mob. Not when you've seen what happens to people who try. And not when you've built your whole identity around his love. It's easy to say leave when you've never been trapped. But when the danger comes wrapped in affection, when the person who terrifies you also holds you while you cry, leaving stops feeling like an option. It feels like betrayal. Over time, she learned to make peace with the contradictions. She could hate him and miss him in the same breath. She could despise what he'd done and still feel tenderness for the man he used to be. The one who'd made her laugh, who'd promised her the world. That's what people never understood about her story. It wasn't about crime. It was about love. A love so deep it turned into a prison. When Henry died, far away, alone, a ghost of the man he once was, Karen didn't cry. She sat down, stared out the window, and felt a strange stillness settle over her. The world had been waiting for that moment for years, as if his death would finally close the chapter. But for her, it wasn't closure. It was confirmation that everything they'd built, everything they destroyed, had led to exactly where she always knew it would. A lonely ending to a life that had burned too fast. She didn't attend a funeral. There wasn't one to attend. He'd outlived his usefulness to everyone. The mob, the feds, even the storytellers who once made money off his name. In the end, Henry Hill wasn't a legend. He was a warning. And Karen, for all the pain he caused her, couldn't hate him anymore. He was gone, and with him went the last piece of the life that had haunted her. In the years after, she lived quietly. The world forgot about her, as it does with most women whose stories are told by men. But she didn't mind. Being forgotten was a kind of mercy. For the first time, she didn't have to perform, didn't have to explain. She could exist without being compared to a movie character or a headline. The people around her saw only what she allowed them to see. An older woman, private, polite, sometimes distant. They didn't know that beneath that calm exterior lived a history darker and deeper than most could imagine. Every so often, she'd catch a glimpse of her old self in the mirror. The eyes still sharp, the mouth still stubborn, the trace of defiance that had kept her alive. She didn't see a victim anymore. She saw a survivor. Not the kind that Hollywood celebrates, but the kind that endures quietly, without applause, without recognition. She'd learned that survival wasn't loud. It didn't come with glory or redemption. It came with silence, with getting up every morning and choosing to keep going even when the past refused to let go. She never remarried. The idea of trusting someone again felt absurd. She'd had her share of love, and it had nearly destroyed her. Instead, she poured her energy into the small things: the morning coffee, the sound of waves on the shore, the comfort of routine. After a life of chaos, normalcy felt revolutionary. There were nights when she still dreamed of him. Not the man he became, but the man he was in the beginning, the one who'd looked at her like she was the only person in the room. In the dreams, they were young again, sitting in the car outside her parents' house, the world still full of possibilities. She'd wake up with tears on her cheeks and the bitter taste of nostalgia in her mouth. It was strange, missing someone who'd caused so much pain. But memory isn't logical. It remembers warmth even when it's been burned. Sometimes she wondered what people would say about her when she was gone. Would they remember her as the mob wife from Goodfellas, or as the woman who disappeared into anonymity? Maybe both. Maybe neither. It didn't matter anymore. The truth of her life wasn't in the headlines or the scripts. It was in the quiet resilience, the small rebellions, the moments no one saw, the nights she stayed awake so her children could sleep without fear, the mornings she smiled when she wanted to scream, the courage it took to keep living when the world had already written her ending. If her life had taught her anything, it was that strength doesn't always look like escape. Sometimes it looks like endurance. Sometimes it's the decision to stay alive when everything in you wants to give up. The myth of Karen Hill would always be larger than the woman herself. The world would remember the legend, not the life. But the woman behind it knew the truth. She hadn't survived because she was fearless. She'd survived because she was terrified, and she kept going anyway. In her final years, when her hands trembled and her voice softened, she found herself laughing again. Not the sharp, nervous laughter of the old days, but something gentler. The sound of someone who had made peace with herself. She'd sit by her window in the evenings, watching the sky turn from gold to gray, and think about how strange life was. How love could destroy and save you in equal measure. How the same world that punished her for staying had never given her permission to leave. She'd been many things in her life: daughter, wife, mother, accomplice, survivor, but never the villain people imagine her to be. She was just a woman who'd made impossible choices in an impossible world. And as she watched the last light fade beyond the horizon, she smiled to herself. The world had told her story 100 different ways, but only she knew how it really felt to live it. And that, in the end, was her secret victory. To be misunderstood, but still standing. To have been loved, betrayed, hunted, and forgotten, yet still here, breathing. The woman behind the myth, unremarkable to everyone but herself. And for the first time in her life, that was enough. Chapter 12. Love, Lies, and the Legacy of Survival. The story of Karen Hill didn't end with the last chapter of her life. It lingered, in whispers, in headlines, in the uneasy fascination people still had with the world she had once inhabited. Even decades later, her name carried weight, though few remembered the woman behind it. The mob had changed, the faces had aged, but the mythology remained, fueled by movies, by nostalgia, by the strange romance of crime. Yet for Karen, there was nothing romantic about it. Her legacy wasn't written in gold or blood. It was written in silence, the kind of silence that comes when you've survived too much to keep explaining yourself. In the years after Henry's death, she found herself thinking about love more than ever. Not the kind of love that burns bright and violent, but the kind that endures quietly. The love she had for her children, the rare moments she still had for herself. She'd spent so long being defined by the men around her that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to exist without them. In the quiet of her later years, she learned to love differently, not as devotion, not as submission, but as understanding. She forgave herself first. That was the hardest part. Forgiveness didn't come easily. Every memory came with guilt attached. Every time she'd lied for him. Every time she'd chosen safety over truth. Every time she'd stayed when she should have run. But when you live inside a lie long enough, truth becomes something dangerous. Forgiveness, for Karen, wasn't about excusing what had happened. It was about acknowledging that she'd done the best she could with the world she was given. The mob had rules. The law had rules. And somewhere in between was her, a woman trying to raise her children in a world where no one ever told the truth. Sometimes, when she couldn't sleep, she'd replay certain moments in her mind, trying to pinpoint the one decision that had sealed her fate. Was it the night she met Henry? The first time she ignored a lie because it was easier? The moment she held a gun to his face and couldn't pull the trigger? But every memory led to another, and she always ended up back where she started, realizing that there had never been just one choice. Her life had been 1,000 small ones, each one made for love or fear, and both emotions had led to the same place. Her children rarely spoke about the past, but she saw it in their eyes, the way they flinched at sudden sounds, the way they kept their lives private, the way they avoided questions about where they'd come from. The shadow of that world had followed them, even after they'd built new lives. She didn't blame them for keeping their distance. She understood too well the instinct to hide. There were nights when she'd pick up the phone, thinking to call, and then stop. What would she even say? "I'm sorry" didn't undo the years of fear. Love didn't erase the damage. It only made it bearable. There were rumors sometimes that she'd moved back to the city, that she'd started over, that she'd change her name again. None of them were true, but she didn't correct them. Let people believe what they wanted. Rumors were safer than facts. They gave her privacy, the one thing she'd been denied for most of her life. Truth had always been her most dangerous possession. She'd learned long ago that silence could protect better than any gun. The fascination with her story never really went away. Journalists still reached out, even decades later, trying to get the real Karen Hill to speak. They wanted her version of the mob, her version of the marriage, her perspective on Henry's betrayals. They wanted confession, redemption, closure. She never gave it to them. Not because she was hiding, but because she knew they weren't asking out of empathy. They were asking out of curiosity. People love the idea of tragedy, as long as it wasn't their own. They loved the mythology of a woman who had lived through the fire and come out the other side. They didn't want to hear about the loneliness that followed, or the quiet weight of surviving something no one should have to. Sometimes she'd catch herself wondering how different her life might have been if she'd never met Henry. Maybe she would have become a teacher, or a writer, or just another woman in Long Island with a quiet life. But the truth was, she couldn't imagine herself without the chaos. The fear and the love, the violence and the glamour, they had all shaped her. Without them, she wouldn't know who she was. The past had scarred her, yes, but it had also carved her into something resilient. She wasn't proud of what she'd endured, but she wasn't ashamed anymore either. In her later years, she moved again, this time by choice. A small house by the water, far enough from cities, close enough to the sound of waves. She liked the sea. It reminded her of survival, endless, unpredictable, dangerous, and beautiful all at once. Every morning, she'd sit by the window with her coffee and watch the horizon shift colors. The ocean didn't judge. It just existed, relentless and patient. It felt familiar. She kept few mementos. Most of what she had from the old days was gone, sold, lost, or burned. But she kept one photograph in a small box at the back of her closet. It was taken in the early years, before the madness, before the arrests and the fear. She and Henry were sitting on the hood of a car, laughing, eyes bright with youth and arrogance. They looked invincible. Sometimes she'd take the photo out and stare at it, not out of nostalgia, but out of disbelief. That girl, the one with the big hair, the bright smile, the reckless hope, felt like a stranger now. She'd lived a dozen lives since then. But she didn't hate that girl. She pitied her, maybe even admired her a little. Because despite everything that came after, that girl had believed in love. People often mistake survival for strength. But Karen knew they weren't the same. Strength was a choice. Survival wasn't. She hadn't survived because she was strong. She'd survived because she'd had no other option. The human instinct to keep breathing, no matter how much it hurts, is more powerful than anyone admits. You don't think about courage when you're in it. You just do what you have to do to make it to the next morning. Looking back, she realized that her life had been a series of next mornings, one after another, until suddenly decades had passed and she was still here. She didn't speak Henry's name much anymore. It wasn't hatred. It was indifference. The name belonged to a story that no longer defined her. The world could have him. She had her peace. But sometimes, when she saw a car that looked like his old one, or when she heard Sinatra on the radio, she'd feel something stir. Not love, not grief, just the echo of a life that had been too large to forget completely. Memory has a way of softening the edges, of turning even the worst things into stories you can live with. There were times she still dreamed of running, not from the mob, not from the law, but from the ghosts. In her dreams, she'd be driving down a long stretch of highway at dusk, the road empty, the air thick with the smell of rain. The radio would play something soft, and for a moment, she'd feel completely free. No names, no history, no fear, just motion. But she always woke before she reached wherever she was going. Maybe that was her curse, to always be moving, even when she stayed still. Her legacy, though she never asked for one, became something of a paradox. To some, she was a cautionary tale, the woman who got too close to danger and barely escaped. To others, she was a symbol of endurance, proof that survival was possible even in the darkest circumstances. But to herself, she was neither. She was simply a woman who'd done what she had to do. She didn't see heroism in it. She saw necessity. People like to assign meaning to tragedy because it made them feel safer, but sometimes there isn't any. Sometimes things just happen, and you live through them, and that's the whole story. If there was any lesson she wanted the world to take from her life, it wasn't about crime or loyalty or betrayal. It was about how easy it is to lose yourself when you love someone too deeply, and how hard it is to find yourself again afterward. Love, she realized, can be both salvation and destruction. It can build empires and burn them to the ground. It can make you feel invincible, and it can make you forget who you are. She'd lived both sides of it, and neither was worth romanticizing. In her final years, she spoke less, thought more. The world around her moved faster, louder, meaner, but she'd already seen enough of what people are capable of when power and greed collide. Nothing surprised her anymore. The world had changed, but human nature hadn't. The same hunger that drove the men she once knew still lived in boardrooms and governments, in every corner where people traded morality for advantage. The settings were different, but the game was the same. And yet, for all her cynicism, she hadn't lost her faith in people entirely. She'd met kindness too, strangers who'd helped without knowing who she was, neighbors who treated her like anyone else. After a lifetime of lies and violence, those small acts meant everything. They reminded her that goodness still existed, even if it was quiet and fleeting. When she thought about legacy, not the myth, but the real one, she hoped her story might serve as something simple, a reminder that survival isn't about glory. It's about grace. It's about facing the worst parts of yourself and choosing to keep going anyway. The woman the world thought they knew, the mob wife, the accomplice, the character, had been a mask. The real Karen Hill was someone who'd learned that strength doesn't come from power or control. It comes from endurance. The last time she stood by the ocean, the wind was cold, the sky pale with the promise of rain. The waves crashed against the rocks with a rhythm she recognized, relentless, unending, alive. She thought about the years behind her, about the people who didn't make it out, about the life she'd lived and the one she'd lost. She closed her eyes and let the salt air fill her lungs. It tasted like freedom, bitter, real, and earned. And in that moment, for the first time in her long, chaotic life, she wasn't Karen Hill the wife, the mother, the survivor, or the ghost. She was just a woman standing at the edge of the world, breathing, still here, still unbroken, still alive. Chapter 13. The Shadow of Memory. Time had a way of softening everything, even the sharpest edges of pain. But for Karen Hill, time wasn't so much a healer as it was a curtain, something that dulled the noise of the past without ever silencing it completely. In her later years, she moved through life like a ghost among the living, her story long buried but never forgotten. The world had changed around her, yet the shadow of what she had lived through still lingered, following her like an invisible echo that refused to fade. Some days, it whispered in the back of her mind. Other days, it shouted, but it was always there. She had lived many lives by then, each one built on the ashes of the one before it. There was Karen the girl from Long Island, who had believed in the warmth of summer nights and the promise of romance. There was Karen the wife, who had built a castle of fear and called it home. There was Karen the mother, the protector, the liar, the survivor. And now, there was Karen the quiet woman who lived by the water, who didn't answer the phone if she didn't recognize the number, who smiled at strangers but trusted no one. The versions of herself layered over each other like thin sheets of glass, fragile but impossible to separate. She didn't talk much about the old days anymore. When people mentioned Goodfellas, she'd change the subject. When someone said Henry's name, she would look away. The world had its version of her story, polished and dramatized, and there was no point trying to rewrite it. What she carried inside her was something no camera could capture. The smell of fear, the weight of silence, the kind of love that rotted from the inside out. To the public, her life had been thrilling. To her, it had been survival, day after day, year after year. The nights were the hardest. She'd wake to the sound of her own breath, shallow and uneven, heart racing as if someone had just slammed a door. Even after all those years, her body still remembered what her mind tried to forget. The sound of footsteps outside a window, the ring of a phone after midnight, the metallic click of a gun being loaded 2 rooms away. She'd lived so long in a world where danger was constant that safety now felt unnatural, almost suspicious. Peace had become a stranger she didn't fully trust. Sometimes she'd sit by the ocean and think about how strange it was that she had survived when so many others hadn't. The men she had once known, loud, confident, untouchable, were either buried or forgotten. Their power had dissolved like smoke, their names reduced to lines in police files or sensational documentaries. The women, though, were different. They'd been erased, not remembered as casualties, not even mentioned in the retellings. No one ever asked what happened to the wives after the empire fell. No one wanted to know. But Karen knew. She carried their stories too, the ones who stayed, the ones who ran, the ones who disappeared. Their names lived in the spaces between her memories. Women who had laughed too loudly at parties and cried too quietly at home. She had once believed love could save a person. Now she knew it could destroy them more thoroughly than hate ever could. Her love for Henry had been both her armor and her cage. It had kept her alive in one world and trapped her in another. There were moments, fleeting, fragile, when she remembered the good. The way he'd look at her when they were young, as if she were something rare and sacred. The way his charm could light up a room, make everyone feel like they mattered. But those moments had been lies too, carefully constructed to hide the darkness underneath. Love in that world wasn't about tenderness. It was about possession. It was about who you belonged to, not who you were. As the years passed, she began to wonder what legacy, if any, she had left behind. The world would always remember Henry Hill, the mobster who turned informant, the man whose story became legend. But what would they remember of her? Would anyone think about the woman who stood behind him in silence, the one who kept the family together while the world burned around her? Probably not. History had a habit of forgetting women like her. The ones who endured quietly, who carried the consequences without complaint. The ones who didn't fit neatly into the roles of villain or victim. Sometimes, though, she would catch glimpses of her legacy in unexpected places. A news story about a woman leaving an abusive husband. A book about survivors finding peace after violence. A line in a movie about loyalty, about fear, about endurance. She would see herself reflected there, not in the glamour or the scandal, but in the quiet defiance. The refusal to be destroyed. It wasn't pride she felt then. It was something gentler, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, she had left something behind that mattered. Not a story, but a truth. That survival, in itself, is a kind of rebellion. Karen had learned long ago that life never gives clean endings. The past doesn't fade like it's supposed to. It just changes form. Some days it's a memory that flickers like a film reel. Other days, it's a weight in her chest that refuses to lift. She thought she could outrun it once, through name changes and new addresses, through distance and denial. But the past doesn't live in places. It lives in people. It lives in her. She rarely looked at photographs anymore, but when she did, it wasn't with regret. It was with understanding. Every image was a reminder of who she'd been, what she'd lost, and what she'd gained. She wasn't proud of everything, but she didn't apologize for it either. The world had demanded apologies from her for too long, for staying, for lying, for surviving. But she didn't owe anyone that anymore. She paid her debt in full. There were times when she thought about writing her story. Not for the money, not for revenge, but for herself. To finally take control of the narrative that had been stolen from her. But every time she started, she stopped. Words felt too small, too neat, too safe. The truth of her life wasn't a story you could put into sentences. It was something you had to live to understand. The constant tension between love and fear, loyalty and betrayal, guilt and grace. She wasn't sure anyone could ever understand that. So instead, she carried her story in silence, like she always had. She wondered sometimes if Henry had ever truly known her. Not the version of her that fit into his world. Not the one who smiled at the right times and stayed quiet when she needed to. The real her. The woman who saw through him. Who loved him despite knowing exactly what he was. She doubted it. Henry had loved control more than he'd ever loved a person. He saw people as extensions of himself, tools to build his empire, shields to protect his ego. But she had loved him anyway. That was the tragedy of it. You can't choose who you love, only how much of yourself you're willing to lose for them. Her greatest secret, though, wasn't about the crimes or the betrayals. It was about how much of that life still lived inside her. Even after years of peace, she missed it sometimes. Not the fear, not the violence, but the intensity. The feeling of being alive in a world where every decision carried weight. The adrenaline that came with never knowing what tomorrow would bring. Normal life felt dull in comparison. Safety, for all its comfort, was also numbness. There was a part of her that still craved the edge, the rush, the danger. It shamed her to admit it, even to herself, but it was true. Once you've lived in chaos long enough, you start mistaking it for purpose. But purpose, she learned, could be found in quieter ways too. In the simple routines of life. In the act of waking up each day and choosing to keep going. She found meaning in small things. The smell of coffee, the sound of rain against the window, the laughter of children outside her home. Things she had once been too afraid to notice. That was her rebellion now. Not the survival of the mob years, but the survival of the years after. The decision to live gently in a world that had taught her to be hard. The world continued to change around her. The names that had once meant power faded from memory. New stories took their place. But hers endured, quietly, beneath the surface. Every few years, a documentary would resurface, or a book would mention her in passing. People would speculate about where she was, what had become of her. Some said she died years ago. Others claimed she lived under a new name somewhere in the Midwest. She never corrected them. Let the myth live on. It was easier that way. Myths were untouchable. The woman behind them was not. As the years drew long and her body began to betray her, she started to feel a strange kind of peace. The world no longer expected anything from her. She had spent her youth fighting to survive, her middle years fighting to forget, and her final years learning to accept. The scars, both seen and unseen, had become part of her. They didn't hurt anymore. They just existed, quiet reminders of a life lived too fully and too dangerously. Sometimes she'd dream of Henry, not the real one, but the version she wished had existed. The man who might have loved her the way she deserved, who might have walked away from the life before it consumed them both. In the dream, they'd be older, sitting side by side on a porch somewhere, the chaos behind them. He'd turn to her, that crooked grin still there, and say, "We made it." And she'd smile, not out of belief, but out of mercy. Because in dreams, even the impossible can be forgiven. When morning came, she'd wake with the sound of waves outside, the air cool and still. Another day, another chance to keep breathing. The world would never know how much it took to get here, how much she'd lost along the way. But she knew, and that was enough. The shadow of memory was still there, but it no longer frightened her. It was just part of her now, as familiar as her own reflection. Karen Hill had lived a life that most people couldn't imagine, full of danger, love, fear, and survival. But in the end, it wasn't the chaos that defined her. It was the endurance, the quiet strength to keep standing when everything else had fallen. The understanding that some stories don't end with redemption or tragedy, but with something far simpler, continuation. And so she continued, each day an act of defiance, each breath a reminder that she was still here, not as a myth, not as a symbol, but as herself, flawed, haunted, and unbreakable. The world would keep its stories. She would keep her truth. And in that truth, finally, after a lifetime of shadows, Karen Hill found what she had been searching for all along, the kind of peace that no one could ever take from her again. Chapter 14. The Price of Silence. Silence had always been Karen Hill's truest companion. It had followed her through every stage of her life, from the noisy parties and whispered phone calls of her mob years to the quiet exile that came after. But silence isn't empty. It's heavy, full of the words you never say, the memories you bury, the pain you pretend is softened. For Karen, silence was both punishment and protection. It kept her safe, but it also kept her trapped. It was the invisible cost of survival, the price she had been paying her entire life without realizing it. There was a time when she thought the worst thing in the world was noise, the sirens, the shouting, the breaking glass, the chaos of a life on the edge. Now she understood that noise had at least meant life, motion, existence. Silence was colder. It was what came after the world stopped moving. It was what filled the spaces left behind by the dead, the imprisoned, and the forgotten. She had learned to live inside it like a second skin, moving quietly through grocery stores, answering questions with half smiles, speaking only when she needed to. To anyone who met her now, she was just another woman living out her years in peace. But inside, there was a kind of static that never really went away, a constant hum of memory and guilt and unfinished sentences. The truth about silence is that it doesn't erase anything. It just hides it. Karen still heard echoes of her old life every time she closed her eyes. The muffled laughter from smoky backrooms, the soft click of heels on marble floors at parties where danger dressed itself in diamonds. The sound of Henry's voice, smooth and fast, weaving lies into charm. Even after he was gone, that voice stayed with her. Sometimes it comforted her. Sometimes it terrified her. Memory isn't logical. It doesn't care whether the person it resurrects is gone. It just plays the tape over and over, until you stop trying to turn it off. In her later years, the silence became almost sacred. It was the only thing she could control. She had lived too long in worlds where control was a luxury, where every decision was someone else's to make, where speaking could mean danger, where asking questions was a crime. Now, she spoke only when she wanted to, and that freedom, quiet as it was, felt revolutionary. Still, freedom has its price. Her silence made her invisible, and invisibility was its own kind of death. People forgot her easily. Neighbors knew her name, but not her story. They didn't see the weight she carried, and maybe that was for the best. The truth would only make them uncomfortable. But the silence wasn't just her own. It was the silence of every woman who had ever lived through what she had. The wives, the mothers, the girlfriends who had seen too much and said too little. The ones who knew the truth about the men everyone else called heroes. The ones who smiled through bruises and fear because the alternative was worse. No one ever asked for their stories. No one ever wanted to hear them. The mob world belonged to men, and even when it collapsed, the stories that survived were still theirs. Karen had been a witness to all of it, the violence, the loyalty, the betrayal, but history had turned her into a background character in her own life. That was the true cruelty of silence. It erases you slowly, even as you're still breathing. She sometimes wondered what it would have been like if she had spoken out, if she had told the truth when the cameras were rolling, if she had written her own story instead of letting others write it for her. But then she'd remember the cost. Speaking had always been dangerous. The ones who talked never lasted long, not in her world. And besides, who would have listened? People wanted legends, not honesty. They wanted the thrill of the mob without the grief it caused. The truth was too messy, too human, too small for headlines. There were days when she wanted to scream just to prove she still could, to break the silence, to feel alive again. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came out. Years of restraint had made her mute in ways that went deeper than her voice. So instead, she wrote sometimes, not books, not confessions, just fragments on scraps of paper. Sentences that started but never finished. I loved him, but I was afraid. They all thought they were kings. We were just trying to survive. She never read them back. She'd crumple the pages, burn them in the sink, watch the smoke curl up and vanish. That was her form of prayer, a quiet release of everything she couldn't say aloud. People often talked about justice, about closure. But in her world, there had never been such things. The mob never gave justice, and the law never gave peace. They were two sides of the same coin, powerful men deciding who deserved to live and who didn't. Karen had learned that early. The system had never protected her. Not when she was a wife to a criminal. Not when she was a witness to his crimes. Not when she was left behind to carry the consequences. The only justice she'd ever known was endurance, the simple act of outlasting the people and the pain that had tried to break her. There were still people who glorified that world, who looked at the movies and the stories and saw excitement instead of tragedy. They talk about the good old days, about honor and family, as if those words had ever meant anything. Karen would listen sometimes, quietly, without correcting them, let them keep their fantasies. They didn't know the smell of blood on silk or the sound of a child asking if the police were coming back. They didn't know what it meant to live in constant fear of a knock on the door. That world had never been about honor. It had been about power, raw, ruthless, unrelenting. And everyone who lived in it paid the price eventually. She had. Her silence had been the currency of her survival. Every time she chose not to speak, she bought herself another day of safety. But the cost had been high. It had taken her voice, her youth, her faith. It had left her alive but hollow. Sometimes she'd look in the mirror and barely recognize the woman staring back, her face softer now, her eyes dulled by years of caution. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not really, but the fear had left a mark. It had changed the way she carried herself, the way she spoke, the way she looked at the world. She'd learned not to expect kindness, not to believe in happy endings. And yet, there was still something unbroken in her, some small ember that refused to die, no matter how many years had passed. It showed itself in the smallest ways, in the way she straightened her shoulders when she walked down the street, in the way she met people's eyes even when they looked away, in the way she still kept secrets even when there was no one left to hide from. The mob had taken her innocence, but it had also given her a kind of armor. She had seen the worst of people and lived to tell the tale, even if she never told it. There were rare moments when she let herself imagine what it would have felt like to be free, truly free, not just hidden behind new names and new addresses. Maybe in another life, she would have been a teacher, or a painter, or just someone who laughed easily without checking who was watching. She wondered if it was too late for that kind of life. But then she'd remind herself she was still here. And being here, after everything, was its own kind of freedom. When she thought about Henry now, it wasn't with anger. The hatred had burned out long ago, leaving only a strange, hollow understanding. They had both been prisoners of the same lie. the illusion that power could make you untouchable. He had chased it until it killed him. She had escaped it by surrendering. Sometimes she pitied him. Other times, she pitied herself. But mostly, she felt nothing. The past was a closed door, and she no longer had the strength to keep knocking on it. The silence of her later years wasn't empty. It was filled with the echoes of everything she had survived. Every betrayal, every lie, every night spent waiting for a sound that didn't come. She carried them all like stones in her pockets, heavy but familiar. They grounded her. They reminded her that she had lived, truly lived, even if it had nearly destroyed her. People talk about peace as if it's a state you can reach, a destination you arrive at. For Karen, peace was something else. It was the absence of noise. It was sitting alone in a quiet room and realizing no one was coming for her. In her final years, she spoke to almost no one about the past. There was no need. The world had already taken what it wanted from her story. But sometimes, when the loneliness pressed too hard, she'd talk to Henry in her head. Not the real Henry, not the addict, not the criminal, but the version she'd fallen in love with. The boy with the crooked smile and the big dreams. We were stupid, she'd whisper into the quiet. But we were alive. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. A truce between the woman she was and the life she'd lived. As the years blurred together, the silence grew gentler. It no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a companion, a witness that had seen everything and stayed. She no longer fought against it. She let it wrap around her like a blanket, warm and heavy, familiar. The noise of the world faded further away, replaced by the steady rhythm of her own breathing. That was the sound she trusted most, the proof that she was still here. When people asked what she'd learned from her life, she'd smile softly and say, that everything has a price. They nod, thinking she meant money or fame or love. But what she really meant was silence. The price of keeping it, the cost of breaking it, the weight of carrying it for a lifetime. She had paid it all, and somehow she was still standing. And maybe that was the point. Maybe survival isn't about being loud or being brave. Maybe it's about enduring the silence, learning to live with the ghosts, the echoes, the things left unsaid. Karen Hill had lived through everything the world could throw at her. And in the end, what remained wasn't fear or pain or even regret. What remained was quiet, a quiet she had earned, a quiet that no one could take away. Because for all the noise the world once made about her, the stories, the movies, the rumors, the real story of Karen Hill was told in silence. In the pauses between words, in the breaths between fear and defiance, in the spaces where love and survival intertwined. The woman behind the myth had outlasted them all. And in the end, when the world finally stopped talking, she was still there, quiet, unbroken, and free. Chapter 15, The Quiet End. The world had long since moved on, but time, for Karen Hill, seemed to slow down in her final years, stretching itself thin like the last rays of a dying sunset. She lived quietly, almost invisibly, the way she had always preferred it. There were no more questions, no reporters, no letters asking for interviews or confessions. The people who once cared about her story had aged, retired, or forgotten. Her name no longer carried weight. And for the first time in her life, that anonymity, the kind she had once feared, felt like freedom. Her days had become simple rituals. Mornings began with the sound of the kettle, the soft hiss of water boiling, the slow rhythm of a spoon stirring sugar into her coffee. She'd sit by the window, the ocean stretching before her, and watch the tide roll in and out like a heartbeat. She liked the predictability of it. After a lifetime of chaos, the sea's repetition was a comfort. Some days she'd whisper to herself, still here. It wasn't pride, not exactly. It was acknowledgement, a quiet recognition of survival, of breath after everything that had tried to take it away. The neighbors thought she was kind, a little reserved, maybe lonely. They didn't know her real name, and she didn't offer it. She wasn't hiding anymore, not out of fear, but out of habit. Her old identity was like an old coat she'd outgrown, worn thin, heavy with memory, but still hanging in the back of the closet somewhere, waiting. She'd lived under so many names that sometimes she forgot which one was truly hers. Karen. The name felt strange in her mouth now, like a word from a different language, one she hadn't spoken in years. In the silence of her little house, memories came and went like tides, sometimes gentle, sometimes violent. She could remember everything with startling clarity. The smell of gunpowder hidden behind the sweetness of perfume, the sound of laughter over music at parties where everyone was armed, the heavy quiet after Henry's rages, the weight of secrets that grew heavier the longer she kept them. They came back not as regrets, but as echoes, sound from a distant life she no longer belonged to. She often wondered what her children remembered. They were grown now, with families of their own, and they lived far away. They called when they could, sometimes on birthdays, sometimes at random hours. Their voices were polite, cautious, love stretched thin by distance and time. They didn't talk about the past. They never did. She could tell they were trying to forget, to live as if their childhood had been normal. She didn't blame them for that. Forgetting was a form of survival too. But there was always a part of her that wished she could tell them everything. Not to justify it, not to explain, but to make them understand that she had done all for them. The lies, the silence, the endurance. It had all been for them. But she never said it. She just told them she was fine. She always said she was fine. Sometimes she'd catch her reflection and be startled by the woman staring back. The gray hair, the wrinkles, the tired eyes. Age had softened her face, but not her gaze. She still had that look, the one that came from seeing too much and trusting too little. She'd trace the lines on her face and think of all the versions of herself that had lived and died in the space of one lifetime. The girl from 5 towns, the mob wife, the mother, the fugitive, the ghost. Now, she was something simpler, a survivor without a story left to tell. In the evenings, when the sky turned gold, she'd take slow walks along the water. The world was quiet then, the air cool, the sea whispering secrets only she seemed to understand. Sometimes, she'd pick up small shells, smooth and worn, and turn them over in her hands. Nothing lasts forever, she'd think. Not love, not fear, not even the weight of guilt. Everything, eventually, is worn down by time. Even the sharpest pain becomes something smooth. She rarely dreamed anymore, but when she did, they were always of noise, of rooms full of people, of voices shouting, of doors slamming. She'd wake with her heart racing, the air thick with ghosts. But she never woke afraid. Fear had left her long ago, replaced by something gentler, acceptance. The nightmares didn't haunt her now. They reminded her that she had lived a life so intense that even time couldn't erase it. Most people didn't get that. Most people's lives faded quietly into routine. Hers had burned bright, and then it had burned out. There was one dream that came often, though always the same. She was young again, standing outside the club where she'd first met Henry. The night air smelled like rain and gasoline. Music drifted from the doors. Sinatra, always Sinatra. She could see him standing there, that easy smile, that glint in his eyes, the way he made her feel like the world revolved around them both. In the dream, she always walked toward him. She never turned away. Every time, she woke before she reached him. She didn't need to. She already knew how that story ended. The past wasn't something she hated anymore. It was just something that was. It had shaped her, scarred her, but it had also made her resilient. The woman she had become owed everything to the girl who had once been reckless enough to fall in love with a man like Henry Hill. There was no point pretending otherwise. She didn't rewrite her story anymore. She didn't need to. She accepted the contradiction, that she had loved and feared the same person, that she had built her safety on lies, that she had survived by doing things she once swore she never would. That was her truth, messy and imperfect. In the quiet hours of her last year, she began writing again. Not for anyone else, just for herself. Not the sensational version, not the one with names and crimes and betrayals. She wrote about feelings, about the way silence sounds when you've lived through too much noise, about the way guilt lingers, even when you've been forgiven, about the strange peace of growing old in a world that has forgotten your sins. Her handwriting was shaky, the letters uneven, but the words came easy. She didn't try to make them beautiful. She just wanted them to be honest. On the last page, she wrote something she'd never said aloud. I was there. I lived it. I survived it. And now I rest. She didn't sign it. She didn't have to. The words were hers, and that was enough. As the days grew shorter and her steps slower, she started to feel her body fading before her mind did. The doctors called it natural, the slow unwinding of a long life. She didn't fight it. After everything, she was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind that comes from carrying too much history inside one body. She wasn't afraid of dying. Death didn't scare her. She had lived too close to it for too long. She used to think death came suddenly, violently, the way it did in her old world. A gunshot, a car bomb, a betrayal. But now she knew the truth. Death could also come quietly, like the closing of a door, like the fading of a song. One evening, she sat by the window, the sky painted in shades of orange and blue. The sea was calm, the air still. She felt a heaviness in her chest. Not pain, not fear, just a kind of final understanding. The years of running, of pretending, of surviving had finally led her here, to this quiet moment. She closed her eyes and let the sound of the waves fill the room. Somewhere far away, maybe in memory, she could hear laughter. The old kind, the warm kind. She saw flashes of faces, her children when they were small, Henry's grin when he thought he was invincible, the friends who never made it out. For once, it didn't hurt to remember. It just felt full. When the morning came, the kettle never boiled. The coffee mug sat untouched on the counter. The ocean kept moving, indifferent, endless. The neighbors found her sitting by the window, eyes closed, the faintest hint of a smile on her face. There was no fear in her expression, no regret, just stillness, the kind of peace that had eluded her all her life. The papers never mentioned her passing. There were no headlines, no obituaries linking her to the life she once lived. She slipped out of the world the way she had learned to live in it, quietly. A few people attended the funeral, none of them knowing who she had really been. The name on the stone wasn't hers, but it didn't matter. Karen Hill had worn many names in her lifetime. The truth of her life wasn't in any of them. It was in the endurance. It was in the silence. Years later, when someone mentioned her name in passing, it was with uncertainty. Whatever happened to her? They'd ask. No one knew. Some said she died in witness protection. Others believed she'd started a new life somewhere, still hiding. The stories contradicted each other, as they always had. Maybe that was fitting. Karen Hill had lived her life between truths, between what people wanted to believe and what really happened. But the real truth was simpler. She had lived long enough to see herself become invisible again, and that, in its own way, was a gift. She had outlasted the noise, the danger, the lies. She had found peace not in justice or redemption, but in quiet, the quiet she had once feared most. The ocean kept rolling in, erasing footprints, smoothing stones, swallowing secrets. And somewhere beneath the sound of the waves, if you listen closely, you might imagine hearing her voice, calm, steady, almost a whisper. Still here, she'd say, still free. And then, like everything else that once burned too bright, her story slipped back into the silence that had always been her home.